Who would have thought the mild-mannered widow, with calloused hands and a soft-spoken voice, could bring a notorious gang of outlaws to their knees? What they didn't realize was that beneath her unassuming appearance lay the brilliant mind of a master hydraulic engineer whose water systems were once commissioned by the wealthiest ranchers across 3 states. They made their biggest mistake when they targeted her windmill, not knowing every inch of her land was connected by an intricate network of pipes, valves, and water traps that could turn the entire property into a weapon at the turn of a lever. By the time they realized who they were dealing with, it was already too late. The floodgates had quite literally opened. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun crested over the rolling hills of Clearwater County, casting long shadows across Catherine Kate Sullivan's sprawling ranch. At 42, Kate moved with the efficient grace of someone who had spent decades working the land. Her auburn hair, streaked with threads of silver, was pulled back in a practical braid that hung halfway down her back as she made her way across the yard toward the windmill that stood as the centerpiece of her property. The 60-foot structure dominated the landscape, its metal blades catching the early light as they turned steadily in the spring breeze. Unlike the wooden windmills, the dotted neighboring ranches, Kate's was a marvel of modern engineering, steel and iron, with a complex system of gears that hummed with perfect precision. The sight of it always brought a smile to her face, a reminder of Marshall, her late husband, and the life they had built together. "Another beautiful morning, old friend," she murmured to the windmill, running her hand along the cool metal base. "Let's see what you've got for me today." Kate knelt beside the small access panel near the base, pulling a ring of specialized keys from her pocket. With practiced movements, she unlocked the panel and checked the pressure gauges and water flow, meters hidden inside. Satisfied with the readings, she made a few notes in the small, leather-bound journal she always carried. Most folks in Riverdale, the nearest town, believed Kate was simply a widow trying to maintain her late husband's ranch. They pitied her. This woman alone on 1,000 acres, with nothing but livestock and the occasional ranch hand for company. What they didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that Catherine Sullivan had designed every inch of the water system that kept not only her ranch, but half the county hydrated during even the harshest droughts. Before marrying Marshall and settling in Clearwater County, Kate had been Catherine Monroe, one of the most sought-after hydraulic engineers west of the Mississippi. Her designs had transformed barren properties into thriving operations from Texas to Montana. The intricate system of pipes, reservoirs, dams, and pressure valves that ran beneath her property was her masterpiece, a project she and Marshall had worked on together until his passing 3 years ago. "Morning, Mrs. Sullivan," called a cheerful voice, pulling Kate from her thoughts. Turning, she spotted young Tommy Jenkins, the 16-year-old son of her closest neighbors, riding up on his pinto. Tommy worked part-time at the ranch, helping with the cattle and other chores, too demanding for Kate to handle alone. "Morning, Tommy," she replied, closing and locking the windmill panel before standing. "You're here early today." Tommy dismounted, his freckled face bright with excitement. "Pa said the Hendersons are bringing their herd down from the north pasture today. Thought you might want some extra hands if they cross onto your property again." Kate nodded, brushing dust from her trousers. "That's thoughtful of you both. I was just about to check the Northeast Creek Dam. You can ride with me." As they walked toward the barn, Kate pointed out a section of fence that needed mending and asked Tommy about his schooling. Their conversation was easy, familiar, the kind that developed from years of shared work and mutual respect. Inside the barn, Kate saddled her mare, a steady buckskin named Penny. The morning routine was comforting in its predictability. Check the windmill, tend to the animals, inspect the water system, and review the day's work with whoever was helping out. Since Marshall's death, These rhythms had kept her grounded, given structure to days that might otherwise have been swallowed by grief. How are things in town?" Kate asked as they rode out, following the path that wound through groves of cottonwoods toward the northeast corner of the property. Tommy shrugged. "Same as always, I guess. Though Mrs. Davis at the general store mentioned some strangers asking questions about the ranches in the area, said they claimed to be investors." Kate's expression remained neutral, but something in her posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Investors? Did she say what they were looking to invest in? Water rights mostly. With the drought conditions getting worse down south, folks say there's money to be made for those who control the water. Tommy glanced at her. Mrs. Davis didn't trust 'em much. Said they had the look of men who take more than they give. Kate nodded, filing the information away. Water rights had become increasingly contentious as dry conditions pushed desperate ranchers to secure whatever resources they could. Her property, with its seemingly drought-proof wells and streams, had attracted attention before. As they created a small rise, the northeast dam came into view, a carefully constructed stone and earthwork barrier that created a reservoir feeding several of the neighboring farms during dry spells. Kate dismounted, handing Penny's reins to Tommy while she inspected the structure. What looked like a simple dam to most eyes was actually part of an elaborate system that Kate could control from various points across the ranch. Hidden valves could redirect water flow, increase pressure, or even completely cut off certain areas if necessary. It was a system designed not only for efficient water distribution, but with security in mind, a precaution from years of seeing how water disputes could turn violent. "Everything looks good here," she announced, returning to her horse. "Let's check on the south fields before heading back. I want to make sure the irrigation channels are clear for tomorrow." They rode in companionable silence, crossing pastures where Kate's small herd of cattle grazed contentedly. The ranch wasn't the largest in the county, but it was among the most productive, another fact that puzzled neighbors who didn't understand how a widow with minimal help managed such efficiency. "Mrs. Sullivan," Tommy began hesitantly as they approached the south fields, "Pa was wondering if you'd consider joining us for Sunday dinner this week. Ma's been worried about you being out here alone so much." Kate smiled, touched by the Jenkinses' continued concern. "That's kind of your mother. Tell her I'd be delighted to come." The Jenkins family had been her closest friends even before Marshall's passing. Tom Sr. and his wife Ellie had stood by her during the darkest days after the accident at the lumber mill that took her husband, bringing food, helping with chores, and simply sitting with her when the silence of the ranch house became too heavy to bear alone. "She'll be pleased to hear it," Tommy grinned. "Last time you came, Pa couldn't stop talking about your suggestions for improving their well system. Said it's working better than ever now." Kate shrugged modestly. "Just a simple adjustment to the pump mechanism. Nothing special." This was her way, downplaying her extensive knowledge of water systems, presenting her suggestions as practical farm wisdom rather than the calculated designs of an expert. Over the years, she'd helped many neighboring ranches improve their water situations, always careful to make her innovations seem like common sense rather than engineering brilliance. They reached the south fields, where rows of corn were beginning to sprout, nourished by the carefully designed irrigation channels that ensured not a drop of precious water was wasted. Kate dismounted again, kneeling to check the soil moisture and inspect the flow regulation gates that controlled water distribution across the field. "Tommy, would you mind riding along the west channel? Make sure there's no debris blocking the flow. I'll check the main gate." The boy nodded and rode off, leaving Kate alone with the gentle sound of water flowing through the channels. She moved to a nondescript oak tree at the edge of the field, using another key from her ring to open a small, hidden compartment in its trunk. Inside was a lever mechanism connected to an underground system that could instantly change water. pressure and direction across the entire south section of the ranch. Kate checked the mechanism carefully, ensuring it moved smoothly. These hidden controls were positioned strategically throughout her property, her insurance against drought, theft, and other threats. Few people knew about them. Even Tommy and his family had only a vague understanding of how extensively she had modified the ranch's natural water features. Satisfied with her inspection, Kate locked the compartment and walked back to where Penny waited patiently. In the distance, she could see Tommy returning along the irrigation channel, waving to indicate all was clear. "Everything looks good, Mrs. Sullivan," he reported as he reached her. "Though I noticed some hoof prints by the southwest corner. Might be the Henderson cattle got through again." Kate nodded. "We'll check the fencing there tomorrow. For now, let's head back. I need to prepare for the supply run to town later." As they rode back toward the main house, the windmill came into view again, its blades turning steadily against the late morning sky. Beyond it stood the modest two-story farmhouse where Kate had lived for nearly 20 years. Its wooden porch wrapping around 3 sides, Marshall's addition during their 10th anniversary. The house looked simple from the outside, but like everything on Kate's ranch, appearances were deceiving. The basement contained a workshop filled with technical drawings, specialized tools, and models of water systems. The bookshelves in her study held engineering texts alongside farming almanacs. Even the kitchen had been modified with a series of pipes that could be connected to the main water system in various configurations, a testing ground for new ideas. "Will you need anything else today, Mrs. Sullivan?" Tommy asked as they reached the barn and dismounted. Kate shook her head. "Not today, thank you. I'll see you tomorrow morning. We'll check that southwest fencing first thing." After Tommy left, Kate led Penny into the barn, removing her saddle and taking the time to brush the mare thoroughly. The quiet, repetitive motion was soothing, another ritual that helped order her days. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Just you and me this afternoon, girl," she murmured to the horse. "Need to go to town and see if I can learn more about these investors Tommy mentioned." Once Penny was settled, Kate made her way to the house, climbing the porch steps with a slight wince. An old injury from a construction accident years ago that still bothered her during weather changes. Inside, the house was cool and quiet, filled with memories of the life she and Marshall had shared. She moved to her bedroom to change for the trip to town, exchanging her work clothes for a simple dress that would attract less attention. Kate had learned long ago that people underestimated women in dresses, a fact she had used to her advantage many times in her engineering days when clients or competitors dismissed her expertise based on her gender. At her dressing table, she paused, looking at the photograph of Marshall that stood in a silver frame, a strong-faced man with kind eyes and a slight smile, taken on their 15th anniversary. Beside it lay his pocket watch, the one possession of his she carried everywhere. "Another day keeping our home safe," she said softly to the image. "Though I'm a bit concerned about these strangers asking questions. Reminds me of that situation in Colorado." The situation in Colorado had been one of their last projects together, a water rights dispute that turned ugly when a corporation tried to buy out an entire watershed. Kate and Marshall had designed a system that protected the local farmers' access while exposing the company's illegal damming activities. The victory had made them some powerful enemies. Kate tucked the watch into her pocket and headed downstairs. In the kitchen, she prepared a quick lunch, eating at the small table overlooking the rear garden where her herbs and vegetables grew in careful rows. Through the window, she could see the windmill continuing its steady rotation, pumping water to the storage tanks hidden throughout the property. The system was Marshall's legacy as much as hers. He had been a carpenter by trade, but had quickly learned the principles of hydraulic engineering to help bring her designs to life. Together, They had transformed this once struggling ranch into a model of water conservation and management. After lunch, Kate hitched her wagon and set off for Riverdale. The 10-mile journey gave her time to think, to plan, to consider the implications of strangers asking about water rights. Clearwater County had been relatively peaceful compared to other areas where water disputes had led to sabotage and even bloodshed. She hoped it would stay that way. Riverdale came into view as Kate rounded the final bend in the road, a small but thriving town of about 500 souls. Main Street consisted of the essential businesses: Davis General Store, the Riverdale Bank, Thompson's Blacksmith, the Prairie Rose Saloon, and a handful of other establishments serving the surrounding ranching community. Kate guided her wagon to the hitching post outside the general store, nodding greetings to familiar faces as she stepped down. Inside, the bell above the door announced her arrival, and Martha Davis looked up from behind the counter, her round face breaking into a warm smile. "Kate Sullivan! Just the woman I was hoping to see today," Martha exclaimed, coming around to embrace her. "How are you holding up out there?" "Just fine, Martha," Kate replied with a smile. "Tommy mentioned something about strangers asking questions. Thought I might hear a bit more about that." Martha's expression grew serious as she glanced around the store to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "Yes, 3 men came through earlier this week, city types, despite their attempts to dress like ranchers. Asked all sorts of questions about water sources, property boundaries, especially about the ranches that seemed to weather the dry spells best." She gave Kate a meaningful look. "Your place came up more than once." Kate's face remained composed, though her mind was already calculating. Possibilities, threats, contingencies. "Did they give names, say who they represented?" "Called themselves representatives of the Western Development Company," Martha replied. "Left some fancy business cards, though I noticed the letterhead doesn't match the name they gave verbally." She reached under the counter and passed a card to Kate. Something felt off about them, especially the leader, tall fellow with a scar along his jawline, cold eyes. Kate examined the card. Western Investment Partners, not Development Company. A small discrepancy that spoke volumes about their credibility. She tucked it into her pocket alongside Marshall's watch. "Thanks for the warning, Martha. I'll keep an eye out. Now about my supply order." They moved on to business, Kate purchasing the provisions she needed for the coming week. As Martha tallied the items, Sheriff Wade Parker entered the store, his tall frame filling the doorway momentarily before he spotted Kate and approached with a tip of his hat. "Mrs. Sullivan, good to see you in town," he greeted her. "Everything quiet at your place?" Wade had been a friend of Marshall's, and his concern for Kate since her husband's death had been genuine, if sometimes a bit overprotective. "Peaceful as ever, Sheriff," she replied, "though I hear we've had some strangers asking questions about local water rights." Wade's expression darkened slightly. "Indeed we have. Can't say I took to them much. Asked too many questions and answered too few." He lowered his voice. "Between us, I telegraphed some contacts in Denver about this Western Development Company. No record of them, but plenty of reports of similar operations buying up water rights under suspicious circumstances." Kate nodded, unsurprised. "I appreciate you looking into it, Wade. Any idea if they're still around?" "Checked out of the hotel yesterday, but mentioned they'd be returning soon with associates. Said they were very interested in the northern properties." Wade's gaze was direct. "Your property, specifically?" A cold certainty settled in Kate's stomach. She had feared as much. "Well, if they come calling, I'll be sure to let you know." Wade seemed about to say more when the door opened again, admitting Tom Jenkins Sr., Tommy's father. His normally cheerful face was etched with worry as he spotted Kate and the sheriff. "Kate, Wade," he greeted them breathlessly. "Glad I caught you both. Just rode in from the north pasture, saw a group of riders heading toward the county line. 7, maybe 8 men, heavily armed. One matched the description of those city men asking questions earlier this week. Kate and Wade exchanged glances. "How long ago?" the sheriff asked. "About an hour. They were moving deliberately, checking landmarks against some kind of map." Tom shook his head. Didn't like the look of them one bit. Kate felt the watch in her pocket, her fingers closing around it as her mind raced through the implications. If these men were who she suspected, water rights speculators with fewer scruples than ambition, their interest in her property represented a threat she had prepared for but hoped never to face. "I should get back to the ranch," she said quietly. Wade placed a hand on her shoulder. "I'll ride out with you, Kate. If these men are trouble, you shouldn't be alone, and I'll gather some of the neighbors," Tom added. "We've all benefited from your generosity with water during dry spells. None of us want to see outsiders causing problems." Kate looked between them, touched by their concern but already formulating her own plans. The elaborate water system that serviced her ranch wasn't just designed for irrigation and livestock. It had defensive capabilities that neither Wade, Tom, nor anyone else in Riverdale fully understood. "Thank you both," she said, her voice steady. "But let's not overreact. They may simply be passing through." Even as she spoke the words, Kate knew better. The quiet life she had built since Marshall's death was about to be disrupted. If these men wanted her water, they would discover that Catherine Sullivan was prepared to protect what was hers, and that the gentle widow they saw was merely the surface of much deeper waters. The ride back to the ranch was tense, with Sheriff Wade, Parker flanking Kate's wagon, his hand never straying far from his holster. Despite his offer to escort her all the way to her door, Kate insisted she would be fine once they reached her property line. "I appreciate the concern, Wade, but you'd serve the county better by alerting the other ranchers," she said as they approached the distinctive arch that marked the entrance to Sullivan Ranch. "If these men are what we suspect, mine won't be the only property they're eyeing." The sheriff frowned, clearly reluctant to leave her. "At least let me ride up to the house with you, Kate. Marshall would never forgive me if I left you to face trouble alone." At the mention of her husband, Kate's expression softened momentarily. "Marshall also knew I'm perfectly capable of looking after myself." She reached beneath the wagon seat and pulled out a Winchester rifle that Wade hadn't noticed was there. "I'm never unprepared, Sheriff." Wade's eyebrows rose, but he nodded slowly. "All right? But promise, you'll fire 3 shots if there's any sign of trouble. I'll have men patrolling the county roads tonight, and we'll come running," Kate promised, though they both knew her ranch was vast enough that gunshots might not carry to the main road. As the sheriff turned his horse back toward town, Kate continued up the long drive to her house, her mind already turning over contingency plans. Once the wagon was safely stored and Penny fed and brushed, Kate didn't immediately go to the house as she normally would. Instead, she walked purposefully toward a small shed about 50 yards behind the main house, a structure most visitors assumed was just another storage building for farm equipment. Kate unlocked the heavy door with a key she wore on a chain, around her neck, slipping inside and closing it firmly behind her. She lit a lantern, illuminating a space that bore no resemblance to a typical farm shed. The walls were lined with technical drawings, detailed schematics of water systems, pressure, valves, and hydraulic mechanisms. A large drafting table dominated the center of the room, covered with blueprints weighted down by brass paperweights shaped like water droplets. Marshall's gift on their 20th anniversary. This was Kate's sanctum, the place where Catherine Monroe Sullivan, the engineer, superseded Kate Sullivan, the rancher's widow. Here, surrounded by the tools of her former profession, she allowed herself to fully inhabit the identity she kept carefully concealed from most of Riverdale. Kate moved to a large cabinet in the corner, unlocking it to reveal row upon row of journals, 25 years of hydraulic engineering notes, calculations, and designs. She pulled out a leather-bound volume marked Defensive Applications 1885 and carried it to the drafting table. "Never thought I'd need to reference these again," she murmured to herself, flipping through pages of intricate drawings and annotations. The designs detailed how water systems could be modified for protection: pressure-triggered water cannons, mud traps, flash flood channels that could be activated to cut off access to specific areas. The concepts had originated during a job in Montana, where a mining company had hired her to design water systems that could also deter claim jumpers and saboteurs. Those same principles had been incorporated throughout Sullivan Ranch, though on a much grander scale. The entire property was honeycombed with underground pipes, hidden valves, and pressure control stations that could transform peaceful pastures into impassable quagmires within minutes. Kate ran her finger along a diagram of the northern approach to the ranch, the direction from which Tom Jenkins had spotted the riders. That area contained 3 major defensive zones, each controlled by innocuous-looking structures: a stone marker that concealed a master valve, a windbreak of cottonwood trees hiding pressure regulators, and an old trapper's cabin that housed the primary control mechanism for the entire northern quadrant. A small smile played across Kate's face as she studied the schematics. The system hadn't been activated in years, not since they'd tested it shortly after installation. It was time to ensure everything still functioned as designed. Taking a small notebook and pencil, Kate blew out the lantern and locked the shed behind her. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the ranch as she headed for the windmill. To any observer, she would appear to be performing her usual evening check of the water pressure, a routine task for any rancher. But tonight's inspection had a very different purpose. At the windmill, Kate unlocked the access panel and made a series of precise adjustments to valves that most would mistake for standard pressure regulators. In reality, she was preparing the primary water distribution system to supply the defensive network if needed. Next, she moved to the barn, where behind a false wall in the tack room lay a series of levers connected to underground channels capable of flooding specific sections of the property with the pull of a handle. "It's still in working order," she muttered with satisfaction, closing the hidden panel and returning to her inspection route. For the next hour, Kate methodically checked each component of her defensive system, making notes of minor repairs needed and adjusting mechanisms that had grown stiff with disuse. By the time darkness had fully fallen, she was confident the system could be activated at a moment's notice. Back in the house, Kate lit lamps in the front rooms, a signal to anyone watching that all was normal at Sullivan Ranch. Then she retreated to her study, closing the heavy curtains before opening a concealed panel in the floorboards beneath her desk. The space contained a metal box, which she lifted carefully and placed on the desk. Inside were items from her past life, engineering awards under the name Catherine Monroe, letters of commendation from governors and railroad barons, and newspaper clippings chronicling her most impressive achievements. One headline stood out: "Female engineer saves mining town." The accompanying photograph showed a younger Kate standing proudly beside an elaborate water filtration system, her expression confident and unwavering. The article described how she had designed a solution that not only provided clean water to a town poisoned by mine runoff, but also created a system to redirect toxic waste away from the water table. Kate's fingers lingered on the photograph, remembering that version of herself, the woman who had challenged conventions and expectations, who had walked confidently into rooms full of skeptical men and left with their respect and contracts signed. That life seemed distant now, but the skills and knowledge remained. When she'd met Marshall Sullivan during a job designing irrigation systems for drought-plagued Texas ranches, She hadn't planned on leaving her career behind. It had been Marshall who suggested they combine their talents, his practical building skills with her engineering brilliance, to create something revolutionary. On his struggling family ranch in Clearwater County, "We'll make water dance across the land," he'd said with that infectious enthusiasm that had first drawn her to him. "Your designs, my hands. We'll turn this place into the most water-secure property in 3 states." And they had. For 15 years, they'd worked side by side, transforming the Sullivan family ranch into a showcase of innovative water management. Word of their success had spread, bringing ranchers from hundreds of miles away to see how a previously unremarkable property flourished, even during the driest seasons. But it was during the water rights conflicts of 1889 that they'd conceived the defensive aspects of the system. A powerful cattle baron had attempted to dam the creek that fed several local ranches, including a portion of Sullivan land. When legal challenges failed, acts of intimidation began. Nighttime raids cut fences, threatened workers. Kate pulled another clipping from the box. Mysterious flooding ruins, Baron's Dam Project. The article described how inexplicable water surges had repeatedly compromised construction, eventually forcing the cattle baron to abandon his attempts. What no one outside the Sullivan Ranch knew was that Kate had designed a system that allowed them to release controlled bursts of pressurized water from underground reservoirs, targeted precisely at the dam's foundations. After that success, she and Marshall had expanded the defensive capabilities throughout their property, partly as a precaution against similar threats, and partly as an intellectual challenge they both enjoyed. Marshall had called it their chess game with nature, finding increasingly clever ways to conceal mechanisms within natural features of the landscape. The memory brought both a smile and an ache. Marshall had been gone 3 years now, killed in an accident at Thompson's lumber mill when a load shifted unexpectedly. His death had been swift, but the hole left in Kate's life remained raw and jagged. After his funeral, she had retreated into the simpler identity of Widow Sullivan, the ranch owner who somehow kept the place running despite her loss. Few connected her with Catherine Monroe, the celebrated hydraulic engineer whose designs had transformed water management across the West. Those who remembered her former reputation assumed she had given up her work after marriage. Kate returned the clippings to the box, her resolve strengthening. If these strangers thought they could intimidate a defenseless widow into selling her water rights, they would discover their grave miscalculations soon enough. A sudden noise from outside broke her contemplation, the distant sound of hooves approaching. Kate quickly restored the metal box to its hiding place and moved to the window, carefully peering through a gap in the curtains. In the moonlight, she could make out 5 riders approaching from the north, moving slowly and deliberately toward the main house. Her pulse quickened, but her movements remained steady as she extinguished all but one lamp and retrieved her rifle. From beside the door, years of working in a male-dominated field had taught her to control her reactions, to never show fear or uncertainty. Those lessons served her well now as she calculated her options. The riders stopped at the edge of the yard, their silhouettes dark against the night sky. One man dismounted and approached the porch while the others remained on horseback, spread out in a formation that suggested they were no strangers to intimidation tactics. Kate positioned herself beside the front window, rifle ready but out of sight. When the heavy knock came, she called out in a voice carefully calibrated to sound apprehensive but not frightened. "Who's there? It's past decent calling hours." "Apologies for the late visit, ma'am," came a smooth voice that immediately raised her suspicions with its practiced charm. "Name's Victor Rawlins, representing Western Development Company. We had some questions about your property that couldn't wait till morning." Kate recognized the name from Martha's description, the tall man with the scar and cold eyes. She adjusted her strategy accordingly. "I don't discuss business after dark, Mr. Rawlins. Return tomorrow if you wish to speak with me." A pause followed, then, "I'm afraid our schedule is quite pressing, Mrs. Sullivan. We've made a very generous offer to your neighbor Henderson for his water rights, and we'd like to extend a similar opportunity to you before finalizing arrangements." Kate's mind worked quickly. The Hendersons wouldn't sell their water rights, not willingly. Their ranch had been in the family for generations, and old Samuel Henderson was notoriously protective of his resources. If Rawlins was claiming otherwise, either he was lying or something had happened at the Henderson place. "As I said, Mr. Rawlins, I don't conduct business at night. Return tomorrow, preferably with Sheriff Parker present, and we can discuss whatever you like." The mention of the sheriff was deliberate, a signal that she wasn't as isolated as they might believe. Through the window, Kate saw Rawlins turn to exchange glances with his companions, a flash of annoyance crossing his features before his smooth mask returned. "Very well, Mrs. Sullivan, we'll return in the morning, but I should mention that our offer is time-sensitive. By noon tomorrow we'll have moved on, and this opportunity for a most generous settlement will have passed." His tone hardened slightly on the last words, the implicit threat clear. "Good night, Mr. Rawlins," Kate replied firmly, listening as his footsteps retreated from the porch. The riders conferred briefly before turning their horses and moving away from the house. But instead of heading back toward the county road, they veered east toward the creek that marked the boundary between Sullivan Ranch and Henderson property. Kate waited until they were out of sight before moving quickly to her bedroom. From beneath her bed, she pulled out a weathered leather satchel, filled with items essential for what might be coming. Extra ammunition, a small toolkit for adjusting the water mechanisms, a collapsible spyglass, and a map of the property marked with defensive control points. Changing into dark trousers and a black shirt that would blend better with the night, Kate braided her hair tightly and tucked it under a dark cap. The transformation was both physical and mental, the socially acceptable widow receding as the strategic engineer emerged fully. She slipped out the back door and headed for the stables, where she saddled a different horse. Not Penny, whose palomino coloring would be too visible in the moonlight, but Shadow, a dark bay gelding Marshall had trained specifically for night riding. The horse moved silently across the familiar terrain, responding to the slightest pressure from Kate's knees as she guided him toward the eastern property line. As they rode, Kate's mind processed what she knew about Victor Rawlins and his company. The discrepancy between the verbal name and the printed card, the heavily armed men, the late-night visit, all pointed to an operation far removed from legitimate business. The drought conditions plaguing areas further south had driven water prices to unprecedented heights, making control of reliable sources like Sullivan Ranch increasingly valuable. Kate had heard rumors of similar tactics being employed in other countries, mysterious companies appearing with offers to buy water rights, followed by accidents or misfortunes that befell those who refused to sell. Wells would inexplicably collapse, streams would become contaminated, or property would suffer damage from unexplained causes, until owners had no choice but to accept whatever offer remained on the table. She and Shadow reached a small rise overlooking the creek, just as the moon emerged fully from behind the clouds, illuminating the landscape in silver light. In the distance, Kate could make out Rawlins and his men at the point where Sullivan Creek formed a natural pool before flowing onto Henderson land. They had dismounted and appeared to be examining something at the water's edge. Kate used her spyglass for a closer look. Her suspicions confirmed when she saw one man unpacking what looked like surveying equipment while another removed canisters from saddlebags. Even from this distance, she recognized the likely contents, chemicals to contaminate the water source, making it appear that Sullivan Ranch was allowing pollutants to flow onto Henderson property. It was an old tactic, designed to create conflict between neighbors and weaken the position of both. "Not on my land," Kate whispered, slipping the spyglass back into her pocket. She guided Shadow to a small stand of cottonwoods that concealed one of her control stations, a hollow tree trunk that housed a series of valves governing water flow to this section of the property. With practiced movements, Kate dismounted and located the hidden panel, using the key from her necklace to unlock the mechanism inside. The controls were ingenious in their simplicity, a series of levers and pressure gauges that could redirect water from the underground reservoirs to specific outlets. Kate made precise adjustments, watching the pressure gauge rise steadily as she diverted flow toward the release points near the creek pool. Once the settings were correct, Kate moved to a position where she could observe without being seen. Within minutes, the first signs of her work became visible, water beginning to seep from the ground around the pool where Rawlins's men were working. The seepage was gradual at first, barely noticeable in the moonlight. Then, with a suddenness that startled even the experienced men, the ground transformed from solid to liquid beneath their feet. What had appeared to be normal creekside terrain was actually an area Kate and Marshall had specially prepared. Soil layered over a network of pipes that, when activated, could turn the solid ground into a quagmire within seconds. Shouts of surprise echoed across the night as two of Rawlins' men sank knee-deep into the suddenly muddy earth, their equipment disappearing beneath the surface. The others scrambled backward, nearly losing their footing on ground that seemed to shift. With each step, Kate allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. This was merely a demonstration, the mildest of the defensive measures at her disposal, but it would send a clear message. Sullivan Ranch was not as vulnerable as they had assumed. Rawlins was shouting instructions, his previously smooth voice now harsh with anger as his men struggled to free themselves and salvage their equipment. Kate used the distraction to return to Shadow and ride silently back toward the main house, taking a circuitous route to avoid detection. By the time she reached the shed behind her house, the distant sounds of confusion had faded. Kate quickly checked her notebooks, making calculations for what might come next. Tonight's encounter was likely just the opening move in what could become a dangerous game. Rawlins hadn't struck her as a man who accepted defeat easily, and his claims about deals with the Hendersons remained troubling. Kate knew she should alert Sheriff Parker, but something held her back. Until she understood exactly what she was facing, involving others might put them at risk. Besides, Wade's jurisdiction was limited, and from what Martha had said, Rawlins and his men had been careful to maintain a veneer of legitimacy in town. No, for now, she would rely on the defenses she and Marshall had created. Tomorrow would bring Rawlins back with his generous offer, and likely with strategies to counter tonight's setback. Kate needed to be prepared for escalation. She returned to the house, changing back into her nightclothes, but keeping her satchel of essentials close at hand. Sleep would be difficult, but she forced herself to rest, knowing the coming days would demand her full strength and sharper wits. As she drifted toward uneasy sleep, Kate's hand closed around Marshall's pocket watch. "First move to us, my love," she whispered. "Let's see how they respond." Outside, the windmill turned steadily in the night breeze, its metal arms cutting through the darkness like a sentinel. Beneath the peaceful ranch, water continued to flow through the intricate network of pipes and reservoirs, Kate's most powerful ally in the conflict to come. Dawn broke over Sullivan Ranch with a vibrant orange glow that belied the tension in the air. Kate had risen before first light, unable to sleep past the earliest hints of morning. She stood on her back porch, coffee mug warming her hands as she surveyed her property with watchful eyes. The incident at the creek last night would have sent a message, but she harbored no illusions that Rawlins and his men would simply disappear. In the distance, Her windmill cut a stark silhouette against the brightening sky, its metal blades turning in the morning breeze. The structure wasn't just a water pump, it was the heart of her entire system, the central mechanism that powered the complex network beneath her land. If Rawlins had done his research, he would know this. The thought tightened her grip on the mug. A movement at the edge of her property caught her attention. Tommy Jenkins was riding toward the house, his Pinto moving at a faster clip than usual. Kate set her coffee down and descended the porch steps to meet him, noting the boy's troubled expression as he drew closer. "Mrs. Sullivan," he called out, slightly breathless as he dismounted. "Pa sent me to warn you. Something happened at Henderson Place last night." Kate's suspicions from the previous evening crystallized into certainty. "What kind of something, Tommy?" "Their main well collapsed," Tommy said, his freckled face grim. "Pa was helping Mr. Henderson assess the damage this morning. Said it looked like someone had tampered with the support beams. The whole thing's unusable now." Kate nodded slowly, the pieces falling into place. "And let me guess, Mr. Rawlins and his associates showed up shortly after with their generous offer?" Tommy's eyes widened. "How did you know?" "They were there. When Pa arrived, all sympathy and solutions. Old man Henderson was beside himself. That well's been their main water source for 3 generations. "Did Henderson accept their offer?" Kate asked, keeping her voice level despite the anger building inside her. Tommy shook his head. "Not yet, but Pa says he's considering it. Without that, they'll lose half their cattle by month's end if the dry spell continues." He hesitated. "Pa also mentioned that those men were asking about you, wanting to know if you live here alone, how much help you hire, that sort of thing." Kate's jaw tightened momentarily before she forced a reassuring smile. "Your father's a good man to send a warning. Tell him I appreciate it and that he should keep a close eye on his own water sources. These investors seem to have unusual business methods." After Tommy departed with promises to return later with his father, Kate moved quickly through her morning chores, her mind working through scenarios and contingencies. The attack on Henderson's well confirmed her worst suspicions about Rawlins and his operation. They weren't merely aggressive businessmen, they were criminals using sabotage and intimidation to force sales. The Hendersons had been targeted first because Samuel Henderson was known for his stubborn pride. Breaking him would send a message to other ranchers that resistance was futile. Kate knew she would be next. Her property's exceptional water resources made it the ultimate prize in Rawlins' scheme. As she finished feeding the livestock, Kate noticed dust rising on the county road. Visitors were approaching, and she had little doubt who they would be. She returned to the house, quickly retrieving her satchel of tools and Marshall's pocket. "Watch," before positioning herself on the front porch, a shotgun visibly propped against the railing but out of immediate reach, a statement that she was cautious but not openly hostile. Victor Rawlins led the approaching party, 5 riders total, all well-dressed in a way that seemed calculated to project legitimacy while maintaining an undercurrent of menace. Kate recognized the attempt to present themselves as businessmen rather than the outlaws they truly were. Clean shirts, vests, and hats that had clearly never seen actual ranch work. Rawlins himself cut an imposing figure on his black stallion, his tall frame straight-backed and confident. In daylight, Kate could see the scar Martha had mentioned, a thin line running from his right temple down his jawline, giving his otherwise handsome face a sinister asymmetry. His eyes were pale blue, almost colorless, and entirely devoid of warmth. The group halted at her gate, and Rawlins dismounted with fluid grace, adjusting his vest before approaching. 2 of his men followed, while the others remained with the horses, their posture alertly scanning the property. "Mrs. Sullivan," Rawlins called, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Victor Rawlins, as I mentioned last night, I trust you're more amenable to business discussions in the daylight?" Kate rose, her posture deliberately conveying a widow's mild anxiety rather than the strategic calculation actually running through her mind. "Mr. Rawlins, I see you've brought friends." "Associates," he corrected smoothly. "Mr. Delaney and Mr. Carver are representatives of our investors." He gestured to the men flanking him, one broad-shouldered with a thick mustache, the other lean, with calculating eyes that reminded Kate of a rattlesnake assessing prey. Kate nodded, but didn't invite them closer. "I understand you visited the Henderson Ranch this morning. Terrible accident with their well." A flicker of surprise crossed Rawlins' face before his practiced smile returned. "News travels fast. Yes, a most unfortunate situation. We were thankfully able to offer Mr. Henderson a solution to his water troubles. How convenient your company happened to be present just when such a catastrophe occurred," Kate remarked, her tone deliberately naive, while her eyes remained sharp. Rawlins' smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "We are in the business of water solutions, Mrs. Sullivan. Now, regarding your property, our company has taken a particular interest in the remarkable water infrastructure here. We'd like to make you an offer that would allow you to retire in comfort while ensuring this land's resources are properly developed." Kate tilted her head slightly. "I'm curious, Mr. Rawlins. Is it Western Development Company or Western Investment Partners that you represent? Your business card seems to conflict with your introduction." This time, Rawlins couldn't entirely hide his surprise. The snake-eyed man, Carver, shifted his weight subtly, his hand moving closer to his jacket where Kate suspected a weapon was concealed. "A simple printing error," Rawlins recovered quickly. "We've recently consolidated several operations, but that's hardly relevant to the generous proposition we're prepared to offer you." "And what exactly are you offering?" Kate asked, moving a few steps down the porch, deliberately drawing their attention away from the shotgun while giving herself a clearer view of all three men. Rawlins smiled broadly, sensing an opening. $20,000 for exclusive rights to all water sources on your property, with you retaining ownership of the land itself. A remarkable sum for resources that, frankly, a widow operating alone can hardly maximize. The amount was indeed substantial, enough to establish Kate comfortably anywhere else for the rest of her life, but the deliberate emphasis on widow and alone confirmed these men saw her as vulnerable, isolated, and incapable of understanding her property's true value. "That is a generous offer," Kate acknowledged, watching their expressions shift toward premature triumph. "But I'm afraid I must decline. This ranch was built by my husband and me together. The water systems here are sentimental to me." Rawlins' false smile vanished. "Mrs. Sullivan, I don't think you understand the opportunity here. Water is becoming increasingly scarce. Those who control it control the future of this entire region. $20,000 is far more than this operation is worth to someone in your situation." "My situation is quite comfortable, Mr. Rawlins," Kate replied calmly, "and I'm well aware of what my water is worth. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have chores to attend to." She turned as if to re-enter her house, a calculated move to gauge their reaction. Behind her, she heard the heavy-set man, Delaney, mutter something under his breath, followed by Rawlins' hushed but sharp response. "Not yet." Kate paused, turning back to them with an expression of polite inquiry. Was there something else? Rawlins had composed himself, though the coldness in his pale eyes had intensified. "Just a friendly word of caution, Mrs. Sullivan. Running a ranch alone is fraught with dangers. Equipment fails, accidents happen. The Henderson well is a perfect example of how quickly fortune can turn. Our offer won't remain open indefinitely." The threat hung in the air between them, undisguised, despite its careful phrasing. "Thank you for your concern," Kate replied, her voice steady. Sheriff Parker expressed similar worries just yesterday. He's been kind enough to increase patrols in this area, particularly after those unfortunate incidents with cattle rustlers last month. Such a comfort to have law enforcement so attentive to our community. It was a bluff. There had been no rustling incidents, and Wade Parker hadn't increased patrols. But the momentary uncertainty that flashed across Rawlins's face suggested Kate's implication had landed as intended. "We'll call again tomorrow, Mrs. Sullivan," Rawlins said after a pause. "Perhaps after you've had time to consider the practicalities of your situation, you'll see the wisdom of our offer." His gaze drifted deliberately toward the windmill in the distance. "It would be a shame if something happened to that impressive piece of machinery. Repairs must be terribly difficult for someone in your position." With that parting threat, Rawlins and his men returned to their horses. Kate watched them ride away, her mind already calculating their likely next move. The pointed remark about her windmill wasn't subtle. They had identified the central component of her water system and were telegraphing their intentions. As soon as the riders disappeared from view, Kate moved quickly to the barn where Shadow was stabled. Within minutes, she was riding toward the Jenkins farm, taking a route that would keep her concealed by the rolling terrain. Tom Jenkins Sr. needed to be warned, and she wanted to check on the Hendersons, not just out of concern, but to gather intelligence on exactly how Rawlins operated. The Jenkins family welcomed her with worried expressions, confirming that they, too, had received a visit from Rawlins and his associates earlier that morning. "Offered me $15,000 for my water rights," Tom Sr. said as they sat at his kitchen table, his wife Eleanor serving coffee. "When I told him I wasn't interested, he mentioned how unfortunate it would be if our creek suddenly dried up or became unusable." Wasn't hard to catch his meaning. "Did you notice anything unusual about their operation?" Kate asked. "How many men altogether? What kind of equipment are they carrying?" Tom looked slightly surprised at the specific nature of her questions, but answered thoughtfully. 8 men total that I've seen, all armed, though they try to keep it discreet. 2 were carrying surveying equipment, but they handled it like men more accustomed to weapons than scientific instruments." He paused. "Kate, you seem to know more about these types than most ranchers' wives would." Kate met his gaze directly. "Let's just say this isn't the first time I've encountered men who use intimidation to get what they want. Did you happen to notice where they've made camp?" "Sir Tommy spotted smoke yesterday evening from the old McPherson property. That abandoned homestead by the North Ridge," Eleanor offered, joining the conversation. "Said it looked like quite a large camp, more than just these men who've been making visits." Kate nodded, filing away this information. The McPherson place was strategically located, with good views of several local ranches, including part of her own property. If Rawlins had additional men there, the situation was even more dangerous than she'd initially assessed. "Tom, I know we don't normally interfere in each other's business," Kate said carefully, "but I'd advise against leaving your property unattended in the coming days. And perhaps it would be best if Eleanor and Tommy stayed with relatives in town for a while." Eleanor frowned. "You think it'll come to violence?" "I think these men won't stop sabotage if they don't get what they want," Kate answered honestly. "They've already destroyed the Henderson well. Your water sources could be next, or ours. They're expecting us to surrender individually, so they're picking targets one by one." Tom's weathered face hardened with resolve. "I'll talk to some of the other ranchers. If we stand together—" "That's exactly what they don't want," Kate interjected. "But yes, a united front would complicate their strategy. Just be careful, Tom. These men aren't common thugs. They're organized and well-funded." After promising to meet again the following day to exchange information, Kate rode to the Henderson ranch. The scene there confirmed her worst fears. Samuel Henderson, a proud man who had never accepted help from neighbors despite several difficult seasons, looked broken. His well A structure that had provided water for 3 generations of Hendersons was a splintered ruin. The shaft collapsed in a way that could not possibly have been accidental. "Samuel," Kate greeted him solemnly as she dismounted. "I heard about your well. I'm so sorry." The older man nodded grimly, his sun-weathered face etched with new lines of worry. 30 years I've maintained those support beams, checked them myself just last week. Then suddenly, in the middle of the night, the whole thing gives way." His eyes held a mixture of anger and resignation. "That fella Rawlins was here at first light with his offer, like he knew exactly when to appear." "Have you accepted?" Kate asked gently. "Not yet," Henderson sighed, "but without that I'll lose half my stock within weeks. Margaret's father dug that well himself. Feels like I'm failing him, failing her memory if I can't keep it flowing." He glanced at Kate. "Rawlins mentioned he'd spoken to you too. Said you were considering his generous offer." Kate's eyes narrowed. "He lied. I refused him outright this morning." Henderson looked surprised. "He seemed mighty confident you'd sell." "I'm sure he did," Kate replied grimly. "Samuel, how would you feel about accessing water from my eastern reservoir temporarily? It wouldn't be as convenient as your well, but it would keep your cattle watered until we figure out a more permanent solution." The offer clearly caught Henderson off guard. Though they were neighbors, the 2 ranchers had never been particularly close. Samuel's pride had always kept him from seeking or accepting assistance. "Why would you do that?" he asked suspiciously. "Because Rawlins and his men are counting on our isolation," Kate answered. "They're targeting us individually, making us desperate, enough to sell. If we support each other instead, we deny them their strategy." Henderson considered this, his weathered hands fidgeting with his hat. "Don't know how I'd repay such a favor." "Stand with me and the other ranchers against these men," Kate said firmly. "That's enough payment." After working out the details of a temporary water-sharing arrangement, Kate rode back toward her property, taking a circuitous route that allowed her to observe the McPherson homestead from a distance. Through her spyglass, she confirmed Eleanor Jenkins' report. At least a dozen men had established camp there, with horses and equipment, suggesting they were prepared for an extended operation. The sun was setting as Kate returned to her ranch, casting long shadows across the land. The windmill stood tall against the darkening sky, its metal frame gleaming in the last rays of daylight. Kate surveyed her property carefully before approaching the house, alert for any signs of intruders or tampering. Finding nothing immediately amiss, she stabled Shadow and completed her evening chores with heightened awareness of her surroundings. Inside the house, she lit lamps in the front rooms as usual, but kept the curtains drawn. Instead of retiring to her bedroom, Kate gathered essential supplies and documents, moving them to the modified root cellar beneath the kitchen, a secure space Marshall had reinforced years ago as a precaution against both natural disasters and human threats. Rather than sleep, Kate spent the night alternating between checking her defensive systems and watching from various vantage points around her property. The nearly full moon provided enough light to detect movement across the open areas of the ranch, but the numerous stands of trees and gullies offered plenty of concealment for anyone attempting to approach undetected. Around midnight, her vigilance was rewarded. A subtle movement near the western fence line caught her attention, 2 figures moving stealthily toward the windmill. Kate observed them through her spyglass, recognizing one as the snake-eyed carver from Rawlins' party that morning. The men carried tools and what appeared to be small bundles, their purpose unmistakable. Kate weighed her options. She could confront them directly, but revealing her awareness might forfeit the advantage of being underestimated. Instead, she moved silently to one of her control points, a hollow beneath a lightning-struck oak that concealed a set of valves governing the western quadrant of her property. With careful adjustments, Kate increased water pressure to the perimeter, sprinkler system, an innovation she had installed ostensibly for fire protection, but designed with defensive capabilities in mind. The sudden burst of water from concealed sprinkler heads startled Carver and his companion, sending them scrambling for cover and dropping several of their bundles. Kate smiled grimly as the men retreated in confusion, clearly unprepared for automated defenses on what they had assumed was a simple ranch. But her satisfaction was short-lived. This had been merely a probing action, Rawlins testing her defenses and response. The real attack would come later, likely with greater force and better preparation. Returning to her observation post near the house, Kate settled in for what promised to be a long night. Her ranch, the home she and Marshall had built together, was now under siege. The coming days would determine whether her preparations were sufficient to withstand whatever Rawlins planned next. As dawn approached with no further incidents, Kate allowed herself a brief moment of rest, leaning against the porch railing as the first hints of light touched the eastern horizon. The windmill's silhouette gradually emerged from darkness, still standing, still turning steadily in the morning breeze. But Kate harbored no illusions about its safety. Rawlins had made his target clear, and the failed attempt overnight would only reinforce his determination. The heart of her water system, the innovation that made Sullivan Ranch exceptional, was now the focal point of a conflict that had been building since the moment Rawlins and his men arrived in Clearwater County. The battle for the windmill had begun. The morning after the failed sabotage attempt, Kate moved through her chores with heightened vigilance. She deliberately maintained her routine, feeding livestock, checking fence lines, inspecting irrigation channels, all while keeping the windmill in her peripheral vision. Every few minutes she would pause, seemingly to catch her breath, but actually to scan her surroundings for any sign of Rawlins or his men. By mid-morning, Sheriff Wade Parker arrived, his expression troubled as he dismounted near the barn where Kate was mending a bridle. "Morning, Kate," he greeted her, removing his hat. "Thought I'd check in, given what happened at the Henderson place." Kate set aside her work, wiping her hands on her apron. "Good timing, Wade. There have been some developments." She led him to the house, where over coffee she recounted her encounters with Rawlins, including the midnight attempt to tamper with her windmill. The sheriff's face darkened as she spoke, his fingers tightening around his mug. "Should have trusted my instincts about those men," he muttered. "Sent a telegram to the federal marshal's office yesterday asking about this Western development outfit. Haven't heard back yet." "I doubt you'll find much," Kate replied. "My guess is they operate under different names in different territories. Rawlins doesn't strike me as a man who leaves a paper trail." Wade nodded grimly. "Seen his type before. Works the edges of the law, uses intimidation first, violence when necessary." He studied Kate with concern. "You should consider coming to town until this blows over. Mrs. Davis has a spare room and—" "I'm not leaving my ranch, Wade," Kate interrupted firmly. "That's exactly what they want, to drive me off so they can claim the water rights by default or force a distressed sale." The sheriff sighed, clearly having anticipated her response. "At least let me assign a deputy to stay here." Kate shook her head. "Your deputies have families, obligations. I won't put them at risk. Besides," she added with a hint of a smile, "I'm not as defenseless as Rawlins believes." Wade raised an eyebrow. "The sprinkler system you mentioned, Kate, these men aren't going to be deterred by getting wet." There was an awkward pause as Kate considered how much to reveal. Wade had been Marshall's friend, but even he didn't know the full extent of the defensive capabilities built into Sullivan Ranch. "Trust me, Wade," she said finally. "I can protect myself and my property. What I need from you is information and legal backup. If you could keep an eye on the McPherson homestead where they're camped and document any suspicious activities, that would help build a case against them if this escalates." Though clearly unsatisfied with her refusal of protection, Wade agreed to increase patrols in the area and gather evidence of Rawlins' operations. As he prepared to leave, he handed Kate a small box. "Extra ammunition," he explained. "And a signal. Flare. Fire it if you're in trouble. I'll have men watching the sky day and night." Kate accepted the gifts with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, Wade. I'll be careful." After the sheriff departed, Kate immediately went to her engineering shed, spending several hours reviewing system schematics and making precise calculations. If her assessment of Rawlins was correct, he wouldn't waste time after the failed nighttime attempt. The next move would be bolder, possibly coming that very day. She needed to be ready with a response that would send a clear message, not just a defensive reaction, but a demonstration of strength that might make Rawlins reconsider his tactics. By early afternoon, Kate had finalized her preparations. She'd adjusted water pressure throughout her system, positioned tools and emergency supplies at strategic locations across the property, and set up a series of early warning mechanisms using modified cowbells attached to nearly invisible trip wires at likely approach points. Tommy Jenkins arrived around 3 o'clock, his young face set with determination as he dismounted. "Pa sent me to help, Mrs. Sullivan," he declared. "Said to tell you the neighbors are standing together just like you suggested." Kate felt a surge of gratitude toward Tom Jenkins Sr., even as concern for Tommy's safety tempered her response. "That's good news, Tommy, but I'm not sure this is a safe place for you right now." The boy straightened, looking both offended and resolute. "Pa said you might say that. He also said to remind you that good neighbors don't let each other face trouble alone." Despite the gravity of the situation, Kate smiled. "Your father is a wise man. All right, you can help, but you'll need to follow my instructions exactly. No heroics." She put Tommy to work, reinforcing the barn doors and windows, a task that would keep him occupied and relatively protected while still making him feel useful. Kate deliberately avoided mentioning her suspicion that Rawlins would strike again soon, not wanting to frighten the boy. As the afternoon waned, Kate's intuition proved correct. The tripwire alarm near the eastern approach sounded its subtle warning, not loud enough to alert the intruders, but sufficient to catch Kate's attention. She quickly moved Tommy to the root cellar with instructions to stay hidden until she called for him, ignoring his protests. Through her spyglass, Kate observed 5 riders approaching: Rawlins himself, Carver, Delaney, and 2 men she hadn't seen before. Unlike their previous visits, they made no pretense of business legitimacy. They carried rifles openly, their postures radiating menace as they rode directly toward the windmill rather than the house. Kate positioned herself behind the barn, where a concealed control panel gave her access to several defensive options. She watched as the men dismounted near the windmill, Rawlins gesturing as he issued instructions. 2 men began unpacking what appeared to be explosives from their saddlebags, while Carver stood lookout and Delaney examined the windmill's base structure. The intent was unmistakable. They planned to destroy the central component of her water system, demonstrating their power while crippling her ability to maintain her ranch independently. With her windmill gone, Kate would be forced to either accept their offer or abandon the property. For a moment, indecision gripped her. She could confront them directly, rifle in hand, but 5 armed men presented overwhelming odds. She could fire Wade's signal flare, but help would come too late to save the windmill. Or she could activate her defensive systems, revealing capabilities she had hoped to keep secret until absolutely necessary. The sight of Delaney placing the first explosive charge against the windmill's base made the decision for her. Kate turned the primary control valve, initiating a sequence she and Marshall had designed for precisely this scenario. The first indication something was wrong came when water began seeping from the ground around the windmill, gradually at first, then with increasing speed. The men paused, exchanging confused glances as the earth beneath their feet softened. Rawlins barked an order, clearly instructing them to proceed quickly before conditions worsened. But as Delaney attempted to place a second charge, the seepage transformed into deliberate jets of water erupting from concealed pipes around the windmill's circumference. The pressurized spray hit with enough force to knock Delaney backward, the explosive charge flying from his hands. Within seconds, all 5 men were caught in an engineered deluge, water shooting from multiple directions with precision that couldn't possibly be natural. Kate allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction as she increased the pressure, activating additional jets positioned to create a defensive perimeter around the windmill. The men were now effectively trapped in a circle of high-pressure water streams, unable to approach the structure or retreat without passing through punishing spray. Rawlins and his men shouted in confusion and anger, their clothes saturated, visibility reduced by the swirling mist created by the crossing jets. One man attempted to force his way through the water barrier, only to be knocked flat by the pressure. Another tried firing his rifle at the sources of the spray, but the water disrupted his aim, sending bullets harmlessly into the ground. Kate maintained the defensive system at full force for nearly 2 minutes, long enough to render any explosives they carried useless and demonstrate that her property was far from defenseless. Then, with a careful adjustment of the controls, she reduced the windmill perimeter spray while activating a different set of jets that created a clear path away from her property, a deliberate message that she was allowing them to retreat. Rawlins was the first to understand. Signaling his men, he began moving along the offered path, his face a mask of fury beneath his dripping hat. The others followed, gathering their scattered equipment as best they could before mounting their equally sodden horses. Before departing, Rawlins turned toward the farm buildings, his voice carrying across the distance. "This isn't over, Sullivan. You've made a serious mistake." Kate remained hidden, watching through a small observation port as the men rode away, their dignified entrance now a humiliated exit. Only when they were well beyond her property line did she shut down the water system and emerge from her concealed position. The area around the windmill was transformed, muddy and waterlogged, with clear evidence of the defensive action that had just occurred. Kate approached cautiously, inspecting the base for any explosives they might have managed to place before her intervention. Finding nothing, she allowed herself a moment of relief. The windmill stood undamaged, still turning steadily in the afternoon breeze. She had won this round, but Kate harbored no illusions about the conflict being over. If anything, her successful defense would push Rawlins toward more extreme measures. She had revealed one of her defensive capabilities, losing the element of surprise it had offered. Next time, they would come better prepared. Kate returned to the house to retrieve Tommy from the root cellar. The boy emerged wide-eyed and bursting with questions. "Oh, what happened? I heard shouting and what sounded like water rushing. Did they attack? Did you fight them off?" Kate placed a calming hand on his shoulder. "They tried to damage the windmill. I convinced them it wasn't a good idea." Tommy looked past her toward the windmill, noticing the muddy ground and lingering puddles. His eyes widened in understanding. "You used the water systems against them, didn't you? Pa always said there was more to your irrigation setup than meets the eye." Kate smiled. "Your father is an observant man. Yes, I used water to protect the windmill. But Tommy, I need you to keep what happened here today to yourself. The less Rawlins and his men know about my defenses, the safer we all are." The boy nodded solemnly, clearly proud to be trusted with such information. "I won't tell anyone except Pa. He should know they made their move." "Agreed," Kate said. "And he should be prepared for them to try similar tactics on neighboring ranches. Once Rawlins realizes he can't intimidate me easily, he'll look for other pressure points." As evening approached, Kate sent Tommy home with a detailed message. For his father, arranging a meeting of local ranchers the following day. Unity would be their strongest defense against Rawlins' divide-and-conquer strategy. After the boy departed, Kate made a thorough inspection of her property, paying particular attention to the windmill and other key components of her water system. Finding no damage, she proceeded with her evening chores, maintaining normal routines that would be visible to anyone watching from a distance. Inside the house, however, Kate's activities were anything but routine. She spent hours at her desk, writing detailed instructions and drawing simple maps that indicated water sources, control points, and defensive features on neighboring properties. If Rawlins escalated as she expected, her neighbors would need to protect their own water infrastructures. As night fell, Kate prepared for another sleepless vigil. Rather than positioning herself in the house, she moved to the barn loft, which offered excellent visibility across most of her property while keeping her presence concealed. A bedroll, water canteen, her rifle, and Marshall's pocket watch were her only companions as she settled in to watch through the night. Hours passed uneventfully, the ranch quiet beneath the starry sky. Kate maintained her vigilance, alternating between scanning different sections of her property and consulting the notebook where she had sketched potential scenarios and responses. Around midnight, a subtle movement near the southern fence line caught her attention. Through her spyglass, Kate observed two figures moving stealthily toward the house rather than the windmill, a change in tactics she had anticipated. They carried what appeared to be containers of some sort, their purpose unclear but concerning. Kate considered her options. The southern quadrant had fewer defensive capabilities than the area around the windmill, but she did have a secondary irrigation channel that could be flooded on command. The question was whether to reveal another of her defensive measures or gather more intelligence about their intentions. The decision was made for her when one of the men began pouring liquid around the base of her porch. The pungent odor of kerosene carried on the night breeze, leaving no doubt about their plan. They intended to burn her out. Kate moved swiftly to the concealed control panel hidden in the barn wall. With several quick adjustments, she redirected water flow to the underground pipes that serviced the yard surrounding the house. Unlike the high-pressure jets that had protected the windmill, this system released water more gradually, saturating the ground and rendering fire-starting attempts futile. By the time the would-be arsonists struck their matches, the ground beneath the porch was already dampening. Their confusion was evident as their first attempts to ignite the kerosene failed, the liquid diluted by the steadily increasing moisture from below. Kate wasn't content with merely thwarting their attempt. Adding another adjustment to the control panel, she activated a secondary system, designed specifically for intruders near the house, a series of underground reservoirs that, when triggered, released enough water to transform the yard into a shallow pond within seconds. The men's confusion turned to alarm as water suddenly rose around their ankles, then their calves. They abandoned their task, splashing awkwardly toward higher ground as the unexpected flood continued to rise. From her vantage point, Kate allowed herself a moment of satisfaction, watching their chaotic retreat. This second defense demonstration was calculated, showing Rawlins and his men that not only the windmill, but the entire property was protected by systems they couldn't anticipate or easily counter. As the saboteurs fled into the night, Kate maintained the flooding for several more minutes, ensuring any kerosene they had managed to spread was thoroughly diluted and washed away. Only when she was certain the fire threat was neutralized did she reset the system, allowing the water to drain back into her underground reservoirs for future use. The remainder of the night passed without further incidents, though Kate maintained her vigilance until dawn. As the first light broke over the eastern horizon, she finally allowed herself a brief moment of rest, her mind reviewing the events of the past 24 hours. She had successfully defended against 2 separate attacks, revealing some, but not all, of her defensive capabilities. Rawlins now knew that Sullivan Ranch was far from the vulnerable target he had initially assessed. The question was how he would adapt his strategy in response to these setbacks. As Kate descended from the loft to begin her morning chores, she noticed a lone rider approaching from the county road. Not one of Rawlins' men, but Tommy Jenkins, moving at his pinto's fastest gallop. The boy's expression as he drew nearer sent a chill through Kate's body. "Mrs. Sullivan," he called, breathless, from the hard ride. "They hit the creek dam last night, the one that feeds our south pasture. Pa sent me to warn you. They're not stopping, they're just changing targets." Kate's momentary satisfaction evaporated. Just as she had feared, Rawlins was adapting, targeting her neighbors to isolate her and undermine the community alliance she was trying to build. The water war had entered a new phase, and the stakes were rising. "Tell your father I'm coming," she said, already moving toward the stable to saddle Shadow. "And Tommy, be careful riding back. Take the long route through the cottonwoods. Don't let yourself be seen." As the boy nodded and turned his horse, Kate felt the weight of responsibility settling heavily on her shoulders. Her successful defense had protected her property, but escalated the conflict. Now, not just her ranch, but the entire community was caught in Rawlins' crosshairs. The coming confrontation would require more than isolated defensive actions. It was time to implement the broader strategy she had been developing, one that would require cooperation from all her neighbors and would turn Clearwater County's interconnected water sources into a unified defense system against those who sought to control them through intimidation and violence. The battle for the Windmill had been won, but the war for water had only just begun. The damage to the Jenkins family's creek dam was worse than Kate had anticipated. As she surveyed the destruction alongside Tom Jenkins Sr., her expression remained stoic, but inwardly she calculated the effort it would take to restore the vital water source. The earthen dam had been strategically breached in 3 locations, allowing the accumulated water to drain into a ravine where it served no useful purpose. "They knew exactly where to hit it," Tom said grimly, kneeling to examine one of the breaches. "Wasn't just random destruction. Someone who understands water systems did this." Kate nodded, noting the precision of the damage. "They're sending a message to me and to anyone who stands with me." Tom straightened, dusting off his hands. "Well, they picked the wrong neighbors to intimidate. Half the county's already talking about what happened at your place yesterday. Wait, folks, tell it. You sent Rawlins and his men running like scolded cats." Despite the gravity of the situation, Kate allowed herself a small smile. "News travels fast." "Always do it when it's worth telling," Tom replied. "Henderson rode over at dawn, offering to help rebuild this dam. Said if you're standing against these water thieves, so is he." Kate was surprised. Samuel Henderson's pride had always kept him distant from community efforts. His offer of assistance represented a significant shift. "We'll need all the help we can get," she acknowledged, "not just for repairs, but for what's coming next." They spent the next hour assessing the damage and developing a repair plan. Kate's engineering background proved invaluable as she identified the most efficient approach to restore water flow. By mid-morning, several neighboring ranchers had arrived with tools, materials, and willing hands, forming a work party that demonstrated the community's growing solidarity. Kate was mapping out the repair zones when Sheriff Parker arrived, his expression troubled as he dismounted and approached her. "Thought I'd find you here," he said, tipping his hat in greeting. "Got a reply to my telegraph about Western development. Nothing official, but my counterpart in Montana remembers a similar outfit causing trouble around Helena last year. Different name, but the description of their leader matches Rawlins." "What happened in Montana?" Kate asked. Though she suspected she already knew the answer, Wade's jaw tightened. 3 ranchers who refused to sell their water rights had mysterious accidents. One lost his irrigation system to sabotage, another's well was poisoned, and the third, he hesitated, glancing around to ensure no one else was listening. The third was found drowned in his own reservoir. The information confirmed Kate's worst fears about Rawlins and his operation. These weren't merely aggressive businessmen. They were prepared to escalate to lethal measures if their intimidation tactics failed. "There's more," Wade continued. "Riders came into town this morning, about a dozen men claiming to be with Western Development. Their foreman, a fellow named Mercer, presented papers at the county office filing preliminary water rights claims on several unclaimed springs in the territory. Legal maneuvering," Kate noted, "establishing legitimate presence while their real work happens in the shadows." Exactly. They've rented rooms at the hotel, bought supplies at the general store, even made donations to the church building fund. Wade shook his head in disgust. Creating an image of respectable businessmen investing in the community while their enforcers operate outside town. Kate processed this information, recognizing the strategy at work. Rawlins was establishing a 2-pronged approach: legitimate business operations in town to win over merchants and officials, combined with continued pressure on resistant ranchers. "Where's Rawlins himself?" she asked. "That's the puzzling part. He hasn't been seen since yesterday." Wade's expression darkened. "After what happened at your place, I expected him to be making threats or filing complaints. Instead, he's vanished, leaving this Mercer fellow as the public face of their operation." Kate's instincts prickled with warning. Rawlins's absence suggested he was planning something significant, something he didn't want associated with the respectable business operation now establishing itself in town. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion at the edge of the worksite. Riders were approaching. 5 men, led by a tall, distinguished-looking gentleman with silver hair and an expensively tailored suit that seemed out of place in farm country. "Speaking of Mercer," Wade muttered, moving to intercept the newcomers. Kate stayed where she was, observing the interaction from a distance. The silver-haired man dismounted with fluid grace, extending his hand to Wade with practiced cordiality. Their conversation appeared civil, though Wade's posture remained tense throughout. After several minutes, the sheriff reluctantly led Mercer toward Kate, performing introductions with barely concealed reluctance. "Mrs. Sullivan, this is Lawrence Mercer, representing Western Development Company. Mr. Mercer, Catherine Sullivan." Mercer removed his hat and bowed slightly, his manners impeccable. "Mrs. Sullivan, a pleasure. I've heard a great deal about your remarkable property." Up close, Kate could see that Mercer was older than he had first appeared. Perhaps in his 60s, with shrewd eyes that assessed her with calculating precision, despite his courteous demeanor. "Mr. Mercer," she acknowledged coolly, "you're a long way from your usual business territories." If her knowledge of his company surprised him, Mercer didn't show it. "Water is becoming the West's most valuable commodity, Mrs. Sullivan. Forward-thinking investors go where opportunity leads them. Even when that opportunity involves sabotage and intimidation," Kate asked bluntly, gesturing toward the damaged. "Damn!" Mercer's expression registered perfect shock. "I assure you, our company operates with the highest ethical standards. If you're referring to unfortunate incidents that have occurred recently, I'm here precisely to address such concerns." He glanced around at the assembled ranchers, raising his voice slightly. "In fact, I'd like to speak with all of the property owners affected by these deplorable acts." His performance was masterful, the concerned businessman distancing himself from unsavory tactics while positioning his company as part of the solution rather than the problem. Kate noted how several of the ranchers seemed to soften their suspicious stances as Mercer spoke. "Western Development is prepared to offer technical, Assistance in repairing water infrastructure damaged by these regrettable incidents, Mercer continued smoothly. As a gesture of goodwill, regardless of whether you choose to work with us in the future, Kate recognized the strategy. Create division among the ranchers by separating the reasonable Mercer from the brutish Rawlins, presenting Western Development as a legitimate business entity, while disavowing knowledge of the intimidation tactics. Very generous, Kate replied, her tone making clear she wasn't fooled. Though curious timing, given that your colleague Mr. Rawlins specifically threatened my windmill before someone attempted to destroy it. Mercer's expression shifted to one of concerned confusion. Mr. Rawlins is a land acquisition specialist who sometimes contracts with our company, but he doesn't speak for Western Development's management. If he's made threats or acted inappropriately, I want to know about it. Such behavior is absolutely contrary to our business ethics. The performance was so convincing that Kate might have believed it herself if she hadn't witnessed Rawlins and his men in action. Mercer was establishing plausible deniability, creating a corporate facade behind which the dirty work could continue while maintaining distance from it. Perhaps we could speak privately, Mrs. Sullivan, Mercer suggested. I believe we may have gotten off on the wrong foot, and I'd like to present our actual business proposition properly. Kate considered refusing, but realized this was an opportunity to gather information about their operation. Very well. Sheriff Parker can accompany us, Mercer smiled thinly. Of course. They moved away from the work crew, stopping beneath a cottonwood tree that provided shade from the strengthening sun. Mercer waited until they were out of earshot before speaking again, his tone shifting subtly from public cordiality to businesslike directness. Mrs. Sullivan, I'll be frank, you have a remarkable water system on your property, far beyond what a typical ranch would require or what a widow would normally maintain. Kate maintained an impassive expression, though inwardly she noted his specific knowledge of her water infrastructure, information that wouldn't be apparent from casual observation. My late husband believed in preparing for drought years. She replied simply. Mercer smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. Indeed, our company has extensively surveyed the watershed in this region. Your property sits atop an exceptional aquifer junction, with water resources that could supply development throughout the territory. Resources that are, forgive me, currently underutilized. I utilize them exactly as much as I need to, Kate countered. Of course, Mercer nodded. But consider the broader economic benefit that could come from proper development. Western Development is prepared to offer you $50,000 for exclusive water rights, a sum that would allow you to relocate in considerable comfort while maintaining ownership of the land itself. The offer was more than double what Rawlins had proposed, an amount that would indeed allow Kate to live comfortably anywhere she chose. Wade's eyebrows rose at the figure, though he remained silent. A generous offer, Kate acknowledged. But, as I told Mr. Rawlins, I'm not interested in selling. Mercer's pleasant expression didn't waver, but something hardened in his eyes. Mrs. Sullivan, I understand your attachment to your home, but water rights conflicts can become complicated. Our company has the resources and legal expertise to pursue our interests through official channels, if necessary. The implicit threat was clear. If intimidation failed, they would turn to legal pressure, tying up her property in expensive litigation that a widow with limited means might not be able to fight. Is that why you're filing claims on Springs throughout the county? Kate asked, establishing legal precedent for future challenges? This time, Mercer couldn't entirely hide his surprise at her knowledge. You're remarkably well informed for a rancher's widow. Kate smiled thinly. I take an interest in water matters. Mercer studied her for a long moment, reassessing. Indeed. Well, my offer remains open, though not indefinitely. I'll be in town for the next week, should you reconsider. He reached into his vest pocket and produced an embossed business card, which Kate accepted without comment. As Mercer prepared to depart, he paused, his voice lowering. "One more thing, Mrs. Sullivan. I understand there was some unpleasantness yesterday at your property. I want to assure you that if Mr. Rawlins acted inappropriately, he did so without company authorization. However, I would caution against taking matters into your own hands. Self-defense has a way of looking like aggression. When presented in a courtroom, the threat was artfully phrased as concern, but Kate understood perfectly. If she continued defending her property, they would paint her as the aggressor in any legal proceedings that followed. After Mercer and his entourage departed, Wade turned to Kate, his expression troubled. "50,000 is a fortune, Kate. It's not about the money," she replied quietly. "It's about what happens to Clearwater County if men like that control the water. Every rancher, every farmer would be at their mercy." Wade nodded slowly. "I know, just making sure you've thought this through. These aren't men who give up easily." "Neither am I," Kate said, her resolve strengthening. "Now, let's help Tom finish. These repairs, the sooner this creek is flowing again, the better." They rejoined the work party, where progress was steady despite the complexity of the damage. By late afternoon, the dam was partially restored, with enough functionality to provide water to the most critical areas of the Jenkins Ranch. Full repairs would take several more days, but the immediate crisis had been addressed. As workers began packing up their tools, Tom pulled Kate aside. "Henderson suggested we all meet tonight at his place, discuss a united strategy against these water grabbers. You'll come?" Kate agreed, though her thoughts were already turning to the security of her own property. She'd been away all day, and, after Mercer's appearance, she was increasingly concerned about what might be happening at Sullivan Ranch in her absence. The ride home was tense, with Kate scanning her surroundings constantly for any sign of surveillance or tampering. At first glance, everything at the ranch appeared normal. The windmill turning steadily, livestock grazing in the pastures, buildings intact. Kate performed a methodical inspection, checking each of her defensive control points and security measures. Finding nothing obviously amiss, she completed her evening chores before preparing to ride to the Henderson meeting. As she saddled Shadow, a flicker of movement near the county road caught her attention. Retrieving her spyglass, Kate observed a lone rider positioned on a distant ridge, too far to identify, but clearly watching her property. The implications were clear. Rawlins might have retreated for the moment, but he was maintaining surveillance, studying her movements and patterns. The confrontation had entered a new phase, a waiting game where each side assessed the others, strengths and vulnerabilities before the next move. Kate adjusted her plans accordingly, taking a different route to the Henderson Ranch than she normally would, using ravines and tree cover to minimize her visibility. The precaution slowed her journey, but she felt certain that watching eyes tracked her departure. The gathering at Henderson's Ranch included almost every major property owner in Clearwater County. Samuel Henderson, standing straight-backed despite his 70 years, had transformed from a solitary, prideful rancher into an impromptu community leader, energized by the threat to their collective way of life. "They tried to break us one by one," he declared to the assembled ranchers. "First my well, then the Jenkins Dam, threatening Mrs. Sullivan's windmill, but they don't understand what kind of people they're dealing with." Kate scanned the faces. In the room, men and women she had known for years, as neighbors but rarely as allies. The atmosphere had transformed from the suspicious isolation typical of frontier ranchers to an emerging solidarity born of common threat. "Mercer's offer is a smokescreen," Kate explained, sharing the details of her encounter with the executive. "They're playing a dual strategy, intimidation for those who resist, seemingly legitimate business for those who might be persuaded. And they're establishing legal groundwork for water rights challenges." "So what do we do?" asked Franklin Mitchell, whose ranch bordered the eastern edge of Sullivan property. "We can't stand guard over every water source day and night." "We don't have to," Kate replied. "We just need to make targeting any of us too costly for them to continue." She unrolled a map of the county on Henderson's dining table, pointing to key water features that connected various properties. "Our strength is that we're not actually isolated. The water in this region forms a natural network that crosses all our properties. If we coordinate our defenses, we can protect the entire watershed more effectively than trying to guard individual wells and streams." The assembled ranchers leaned forward as Kate outlined a strategy that leveraged their interconnected water sources. For the next hour, they discussed practical measures, reinforcing vulnerable points, establishing communication systems for rapid response, organizing round-the-clock patrols of critical infrastructure. "There's something else you should know," Kate said finally, making a decision she had been wrestling with since arriving. "The sabotage attempts at my ranch failed because I have defensive mechanisms built into my water system, pressure controls, and diversion capabilities that can be activated against intruders." This revelation was met with astonished silence, followed by a burst of questions. Kate had maintained the secret of her engineered defenses for years, sharing the full extent of her systems with no one after Marshall's death. "My husband and I designed the system years ago, during the water conflicts of '89, she explained. "With some modifications, similar protections could be adapted for your properties." As the initial shock subsided, the practical implications became clear. Kate's engineering knowledge could help them transform their vulnerable water sources into defensive assets, a capability Rawlins and his men wouldn't anticipate from what they perceived as simple ranchers. By the time the meeting concluded near midnight, a new sense of purpose had emerged. The ranchers of Clearwater County were no longer isolated targets, but a coordinated alliance, with plans to begin implementing defensive modifications the very next day. As Kate prepared to depart, Samuel Henderson approached her, his weathered face solemn. "Never thought I'd see the day when the whole county came together like this. You've done something remarkable here, Catherine." Kate shook her head. "Rawlins and Mercer did it for us. Nothing unites people like a common enemy." "Maybe so," Henderson conceded. "But it took someone who understood both the technical problems and the human ones to show us a path forward." He paused, seeming to struggle with his next words. "My Margaret always spoke highly of you, you know, said you were the smartest woman she'd ever met, even if you did hide it behind being a rancher's wife." The mention of Margaret Henderson, Samuel's late wife, and one of the few people who had known Kate's full background, brought an unexpected lump to Kate's throat. "She was a remarkable woman herself. I miss her wisdom." Samuel nodded, emotion briefly crossing his stoic features. "She'd be proud to see what you're doing, and she'd want me to tell you to be careful. These men, there's something unnatural about how determined they are. It's not just business to them." Kate had sensed the same thing. Rawlins' cold intensity and Mercer's calculated maneuvering suggested stakes beyond ordinary water rights acquisition. The ride home was tense, with Kate taking an even more circuitous route and stopping frequently to ensure she wasn't being followed. The ranch appeared undisturbed when she arrived, but she performed another thorough inspection before finally allowing herself a few hours of rest. Morning brought clear skies and a deceptive sense of normalcy as Kate went about her chores. Tommy Jenkins arrived mid-morning with news that work parties were forming to implement the defensive strategies they had developed at the previous night's meeting. As they walked toward the barn, Tommy suddenly froze, pointing toward the ridge line beyond Kate's northern pasture. "Mrs. Sullivan, look!" Kate followed his gesture, her blood running cold at the sight. Along the ridge, at least 20 riders had assembled, their silhouettes clearly visible against the sky. They made no move to approach, simply maintaining their position overlooking Sullivan Ranch, a wordless message that needed no interpretation. Rawlins was demonstrating his resources, showing Kate and, by extension, the entire community that he had enough men to overwhelm any individual ranch. The display of force was calculated to intimidate, to make their unified defense seem futile before it even began. "What do we do?" Tommy asked, his young voice steady despite the clear threat. Kate watched the distant riders for a long moment before answering. "We stick to the plan. Tell your father what you've seen, but make sure everyone knows not to be deterred. This is just another tactic. They're trying to break our resolve before we can organize properly." After Tommy departed to spread the word, Kate returned to her engineering shed, spending hours reviewing designs for defensive modifications that could be implemented on neighboring properties. The distant watchers maintained their position throughout the day, an unnerving presence that Kate refused to acknowledge outwardly, while inwardly calculating how their surveillance might affect her plans. As dusk approached, the riders finally dispersed, disappearing over the ridge as silently as they had appeared. Kate knew this wasn't a retreat, but a strategic repositioning. Rawlins had delivered his message, a promise that he commanded enough men to return in overwhelming force when the time came. That night, Kate penned letters to contacts from her engineering days, former colleagues and clients who might provide information about Western Development's operations in other territories. If she was to counter Rawlins and Mercer effectively, she needed to understand their true objectives and methods beyond what could be observed locally. As she sealed the envelopes, Kate realized the conflict had reached a pivotal juncture. The initial skirmishes, Henderson's Well, the Jenkins Dam, the attempt on her windmill, had been merely opening moves. Rawlins' show of force and Mercer's legal maneuvering signaled the beginning of a more coordinated campaign. The ranchers of Clearwater County had formed their alliance, but Kate knew that implementing their defensive strategies would take time that Rawlins might not give them. The next phase of the conflict would determine whether their community solidarity could withstand the pressure of Rawlins' full resources. With that sobering thought, Kate checked her defensive systems one final time before settling in for another night of vigilance. The windmill turned steadily in the evening breeze, a reminder of what she fought to protect, not just her property, but the independence and future of the entire region. The water war had entered a new phase, and Kate Sullivan stood at its center, a widow with hidden talents preparing to face the gathering storm. Dawn broke over Clearwater County with an unusual flurry of activity. Ranchers who typically worked their lands in relative isolation were now moving between properties in coordinated groups, carrying tools, materials, and determination in equal measure. The display of riders on the ridge the previous day had strengthened their resolve rather than weakening it. Rawlins' attempt at intimidation had backfired, transforming concern into defiance. Kate had risen well before first light, reviewing her plans one final time before setting them in motion. The kitchen table was covered with hand-drawn schematics, simplified versions of hydraulic defense systems that could be implemented on neighboring ranches without requiring her neighbors to understand the complex engineering principles behind them. A knock at the door announced the arrival of Tom Jenkins Sr. and 4 other ranchers, right on schedule. Kate invited them in, serving coffee while spreading the diagrams across the table. "These aren't as sophisticated as my systems," she explained, pointing to the drawings, "but they don't need to be. The goal is to create a unified defensive network that protects critical water points across all our properties." The men studied the plans with varying degrees of comprehension. Frank Mitchell, whose orchard bordered Sullivan Ranch to the east, looked up with newfound respect. "Always wondered how your place stayed so green even in drought years," he remarked. "Figured Marshall had some special techniques, but this is something else entirely. Kate smiled briefly at the mention of her husband. Marshall was good with his hands, but these systems were a joint effort. The principles are simpler than they look. We're just using water pressure and redirection to create defensive capabilities. 4. The next hour, Kate explained the modifications required for each property, assigning teams and prioritizing the most vulnerable water sources. Her clear instructions and practical approach bridged the gap between her engineering expertise and the ranchers' hands-on experience with their lands. As the meeting concluded, Samuel Henderson lingered behind while the others headed out to begin the day's work. "You didn't sleep last night," he observed, his weathered face concerned. Kate didn't bother denying it. Too much to organize. Henderson nodded slowly. "Margaret used to say there are 2 kinds of sleepless nights, the ones that wear you down, and the ones that fire you up. You seem to be having the second kind." "Your wife was a perceptive woman," Kate replied with a genuine smile. "And you're right. I've spent years hiding what I know, pretending to be just a rancher's widow. It feels liberating to use my skills openly again." "Well, we're lucky to have them," Henderson said simply. "But pace yourself. This isn't going to be a short fight." After Henderson departed, Kate gathered essential tools and loaded them into her wagon. Today, she would personally supervise modifications at 4 different ranches, teaching their owners how to implement and maintain the defensive systems she had designed. As she prepared to leave, Sheriff Parker arrived, his expression a mixture of concern and determination. "More of Mercer's men came into town last night," he reported without preamble, "bringing their total to about 30 that I can account for. They're being careful to maintain a respectable appearance in town, paying for rooms at the hotel, eating at the restaurant, even attending church services. While Rawlins keeps his rougher elements at the McPherson place," Kate added, completing the picture. "They're establishing 2 separate operations, one legitimate, one not, with plausible deniability between them." Wade nodded grimly. "Mayor, Wilson had dinner with Mercer last night. This morning, he was talking about the economic opportunity Western development represents for Riverdale. They're working the political angle too." Kate wasn't surprised. It was a sophisticated strategy, isolating resistance while building support among town merchants and officials who stood to benefit from development investment. "Have your telegrams produced any useful information?" she asked. "Nothing concrete enough to take action on," Wade admitted. "Rumors and suspicions from 3 territories, but no official complaints or charges that stuck. These men know how to skirt the edges of the law. Then we'll have to protect ourselves within those same boundaries," Kate said. "I'm heading out to help implement defensive measures across the county. Can you keep an eye on my place while I'm gone?" Wade agreed. Though his expression suggested he thought Kate should have an armed escort, she understood his concern, but knew her time was better spent equipping her neighbors with the means to protect themselves rather than focusing solely on her own property. The day passed in a blur of activity as Kate moved from ranch to ranch, supervising the installation of modified water control systems. At the Mitchell orchard, they created pressure-activated sprayers hidden among the fruit, trees capable of drenching intruders or extinguishing fire attempts. At the Peterson dairy farm, they established a network of channels that could quickly flood the approach to the main well, turning solid ground into impassable mud within minutes. Each implementation was adapted to the unique geography and water sources of the property, with Kate carefully instructing the owners on operation and maintenance. By mid-afternoon, 4 ranches had basic hydraulic defenses in place, not as sophisticated as Sullivan Ranch's systems, but functional and unexpected. As Kate supervised the final adjustments at the Wilkins place, their teenage son Ben came running from the house, breathless with news. "Riders coming," he called. "Looks like Rawlins' men." Kate and Wilkins exchanged glances before moving quickly to a vantage point that allowed them to observe the approach without being easily spotted. Through her spyglass, Kate counted 5 riders moving purposefully toward the Wilkins main water reservoir, a crucial source that supplied both house and livestock. Perfect timing, Kate muttered, a grim satisfaction in her voice. Let's see if our modifications work as planned. Wilkins looked uncertain, but followed Kate's lead as she directed him to the newly installed control valve hidden behind the tool shed. With quick instructions, she showed him how to activate the defensive system they had spent the morning installing. Wait until they're fully committed to whatever they're planning, she advised. We want them to reveal their intentions before we respond. The riders dismounted near the reservoir, unaware they were being observed. 2 men began unpacking what appeared to be tools for sabotage, while the others stood guard, scanning the area, but failing to spot Kate and Wilkins in their concealed position. Now, Kate whispered when the saboteurs had moved onto the reservoir's earthen dam and begun working. Wilkins turned the control valve with a firm twist. For a moment, nothing happened. Then water began seeping from concealed pipes positioned around the reservoir's perimeter. Unlike the dramatic jets Kate had used at her windmill, this system was subtler, designed to saturate the ground gradually, undermining footing rather than creating an immediate spectacle. The effect became apparent when one of the saboteurs suddenly lost his balance, sliding down the now muddy embankment with a startled shout. His companion reached to help him, only to lose his own footing as the supposedly solid ground turned, treacherously slick beneath him. The guards rushed forward, confusion evident in their movements as they encountered the mysteriously deteriorating conditions. One man drew his pistol, firing aimlessly at the surrounding trees in frustration or intimidation, a move that suggested these were indeed Rawlins' men rather than Mercer's respectable associates. Kate nodded to Wilkins, who adjusted the valve to increase water flow to a second set of pipes. These released their contents more forcefully, creating visible streams that converged on the area where the men struggled to maintain their footing. Within moments, the saboteurs found themselves not just slipping, but actively fighting against flowing water that seemed to target them specifically. The scene quickly transformed from attempted sabotage to chaotic retreat as the men abandoned their tools and scrambled back to their horses, cursing and shouting accusations at each other. Their dignified arrival became an undignified departure, with mud-covered figures mounting skittish horses while casting baffled glances at the seemingly innocent reservoir that had somehow fought back. Kate and Wilkins remained hidden until the riders had disappeared from view, then emerged to inspect the reservoir. The would-be saboteurs had managed to place some tools before the defense activated, but no significant damage had been done. That was something to see, Wilkins said, shaking his head in amazement as he surveyed the now muddy approaches to his reservoir. Never would have believed water could be used like that if I hadn't seen it myself. And now they've seen it too, Kate pointed out. They'll be more cautious in their next attempt, but also more confused. They expected vulnerable targets, not coordinated defenses. Word of the failed sabotage at the Wilkins ranch spread quickly through the community. By evening, when Kate returned to Sullivan Ranch, 3 other ranchers had reported similar incidents, all thwarted by the newly implemented defensive measures. Rawlins had apparently launched a coordinated effort against multiple water sources simultaneously, expecting easy success but encountering unexpected resistance at every turn. Sheriff Parker was waiting at Kate's house, his expression suggesting mixed news. "Heard about the excitement today," he said as she dismounted. 4 attempted sabotage efforts, all failed. Rawlins' men didn't even manage to identify what was happening to them. Kate nodded, satisfaction evident despite her exhaustion. The systems worked as designed, simple but effective. That's the good news, Wade agreed. The less good news is that Mercer has been busy in town. He scheduled a public meeting tomorrow to present Western Development's vision for regional water management. Mayor Wilson is fully supportive, and most of the merchants are intrigued by promises of increased commerce. Kate had expected this development, though perhaps not quite so soon. They're accelerating their timeline. Today's failures have pushed them to strengthen their political position while Rawlins regroups. There's more, Wade added reluctantly. Mercer paid a visit to Judge Harmon this afternoon. I couldn't hear their conversation, but afterward the judge was asking about water rights documentation and regulatory compliance for ranches in the county. This was concerning news. Judge Elias Harmon was the senior judicial authority in Clearwater County, responsible for settling legal disputes, including those involving property and water rights. If Mercer was cultivating his influence, it suggested a legal challenge might be forthcoming. They're setting up multiple pressure points, Kate noted, thinking aloud. Sabotage, political influence, and now potential legal action. We need to be prepared on all fronts. Wade nodded grimly. I've sent more telegrams to federal authorities about their activities, but without clear evidence of law-breaking, there's not much official action I can request. After the sheriff departed, Kate performed a thorough inspection of her property before finally allowing herself a brief rest. The day's successes had bought them valuable time, but she harbored no illusions about the challenges ahead. Rawlins and Mercer would adapt their tactics, and the defensive measures implemented thus far would not suffice against determined adversaries with resources and ruthlessness on their side. The following morning brought another council of local ranchers, this time gathered in Kate's barn. The mood was cautiously triumphant after yesterday's successful defenses, but all recognized that they had merely won the opening skirmish, not the war. They'll be back, and better prepared, Tom Jenkins Sr. warned. These aren't men who accept defeat easily. And while Rawlins' thugs were failing in the field, Mercer was winning support in town, added Peterson, whose brother owned the general store in Riverdale. Promising economic growth, development contracts for local businesses, even donations to community projects. Kate listened to each report, mentally assembling a comprehensive picture of their adversaries' strategy. When everyone had spoken, she unrolled a large map of the county, weighted at the corners with tools from her workbench. We've secured individual water sources with basic defenses, she began, indicating the properties they had modified the previous day. That slowed them down but won't stop them. To truly protect the watershed, we need to think bigger. Her finger traced the network of streams, springs, and underground aquifers that connected the various properties throughout Clearwater County. Water doesn't recognize property lines. It flows where geology dictates. We need to use that reality to our advantage. For the next hour, Kate outlined a more ambitious plan, an integrated defensive network that would transform the county's interconnected water sources into a unified system. By linking their individual defensive capabilities and establishing communication protocols, they could respond collectively to threats against any single property. It will require cooperation beyond anything we've attempted before, she acknowledged. Shared access points, coordinated responses, resource pooling. Some of you will need to permit water flows across your lands that benefit others more than yourselves. The proposal might once have met with skepticism or outright rejection from independent-minded ranchers protective of their resources. But the events of recent days had shifted perspectives dramatically. The communal nodding and thoughtful expressions suggested Kate's proposal was falling on receptive ears. Samuel Henderson spoke first, his authority among the older ranchers lending weight to his words. My father and grandfather would have sooner died than allow shared control of their water, but they never faced enemies like these. Times change, and we must change with them or perish. His endorsement opened the floodgates of discussion, with ranchers offering suggestions, raising concerns, and ultimately committing to the integrated approach Kate had proposed. By meeting's end, they had established work teams, communication protocols, and a schedule for implementing the expanded defensive network. As the gathering dispersed, Tom Jenkins Sr. lingered behind, helping Kate roll up maps and diagrams. "You've unified this community more in 3 days than anyone's managed in 30 years, he observed. "Never thought I'd see Mitchell and Henderson agreeing on water management." Kate smiled tiredly. "Necessity makes unlikely allies." "It's more than that," Tom insisted. "It's leadership. You've given us a way forward that protects everyone, not just a chosen few. That's rare in water disputes." The compliment warmed Kate, though she deflected it with a practical observation. "We'll need every alliance we can build. While we're preparing our defenses, Mercer is consolidating support in town. The community meeting he's organized today could turn public opinion against us if we're not careful." Tom nodded grimly. "Several of us plan to attend, make sure our side of the story is heard." After finalizing plans for continued defensive implementations throughout the county, Kate turned her attention to another critical preparation. From a locked cabinet in her engineering shed, she retrieved hydraulic design documents dating back to her professional career. Technical specifications and analyses of water systems throughout the region. Among these were surveys she had conducted years ago of the watershed that supplied Clearwater County, studies that mapped aquifer connections, underground flows, and geological formations in extraordinary detail. This knowledge had informed her designs for Sullivan Ranch, but she had never shared the full extent of her understanding with anyone except Marshall. Now, these documents might prove crucial in countering any legal challenges Mercer attempted to mount through Judge Harmon. Kate spent hours organizing the relevant materials, preparing clear explanations for non-technical audiences, and identifying key points that would support the ranch's water rights claims. By late afternoon, she had assembled a comprehensive dossier that established both the scientific basis for the county's interconnected water management and the historical precedent for cooperative stewardship. If Mercer attempted to challenge their water rights on technical grounds, they would be prepared to demonstrate their thorough understanding and responsible management of the resource. As Kate finished this work, Tommy Jenkins arrived with news. From town, Mercer's community meeting had drawn a substantial crowd, with his promises of economic development and regional prosperity resonating particularly with townspeople who didn't directly depend on ranching for their livelihoods. "He talks real smooth," Tommy reported, accepting the glass of lemonade Kate offered. "Making it sound like Western development just wants to optimize water resources for maximum community benefit. Says the current system wastes water that could support new businesses, more farms, even a rail spur that would connect Riverdale directly to the main line." "And how was it received?" Kate asked, though she could guess the answer from Tommy's troubled expression. "Mixed. Storekeepers and such were pretty enthusiastic. Ranchers who attended tried to raise concerns, but Mercer had answers for everything. Made them sound selfish for wanting to maintain current water rights." Tommy hesitated. "He mentioned you specifically, Mrs. Sullivan. Said your property controls disproportionate water resources that could serve hundreds of families if properly developed." Kate had expected to become a specific target. Her property's exceptional water resources made it the crown jewel of Western Development's acquisition aims, and her resistance made her an obstacle to be removed, either through purchase, intimidation, or public pressure. "Did he mention yesterday's incidents?" she asked. Tommy shook his head. "Not directly. Just talked about regrettable misunderstandings and commitment to peaceful resolution of differences. Made it sound like any problems were due to ranchers being stubborn, not his men trying to sabotage water sources." This aligned with the Strategy Kate had anticipated, Mercer maintaining plausible deniability about Rawlins' methods while applying pressure through seemingly legitimate channels. The approach was sophisticated and would be effective in dividing town and rural interests, if not countered properly. "One more thing," Tommy added. "Pa said to tell you they spotted surveyors working along the North Ridge this morning. Not just looking, but placing markers and taking measurements. They had Western Development Company markings on their equipment." This development puzzled Kate. The North Ridge contained no significant water sources that weren't already claimed by existing ranches. What would Western Development hope to gain by surveying that area? After Tommy departed with messages for his father, Kate saddled Shadow and rode to the northern boundary of her property. From there, she could observe the ridge in question without trespassing on adjacent lands. Through her spyglass, she spotted the survey team. 3 men working methodically along the ridgeline, placing markers and recording measurements in a pattern that suggested they were mapping something specific rather than conducting a general survey. Kate's engineering background allowed her to recognize the purpose of their activities before most would have discerned it. They weren't surveying for water sources. They were mapping a potential dam site. The topography of the North Ridge, with its natural narrowing at the eastern end, could theoretically support a large-scale water impoundment structure. The implications sent a chill through Kate, despite the warm afternoon sun. Western Development wasn't just seeking to acquire existing water rights. They were planning to fundamentally alter the watershed itself, creating a reservoir that would give them control over water flow to the entire county. Such a project would require substantial capital investment, but would ultimately allow them to dictate terms to every property owner in the region. Those who cooperated would receive water. Those who resisted would find their allocations mysteriously reduced during crucial growing seasons. This discovery transformed Kate's understanding of the conflict. Rawlins's sabotage efforts and Mercer's acquisition attempts weren't separate tactics. They were coordinated parts of a larger strategy. By damaging existing water infrastructure and pressuring vulnerable ranches to sell, they were systematically clearing obstacles to their ultimate goal of centralized water control. Kate rode home with renewed urgency, her mind racing with implications and counter-strategies. The defensive measures they had implemented would protect individual water sources in the short term, but would be ineffective against the long-term threat of a major dam project that could redirect the entire watershed. This fight would require not just engineering knowledge and community solidarity, but legal and political action beyond Clearwater County. Federal regulations governed major waterway modifications, and state authorities had oversight of projects affecting multiple communities. As Kate approached her ranch, the Windmill came into view, its metal blades turning steadily against the late afternoon sky. The sight strengthened her resolve. What she and her neighbors were protecting wasn't just their individual properties, but a way of life built on independence and self-determination, values that would be fundamentally undermined if a single corporation gained control of the resource essential to everyone's survival. The preparation for conflict had entered a new phase. Their defensive measures would buy time, but Kate now recognized they needed to take more proactive steps. Tomorrow, she would expand their plans to include documentation of Western Development's activities for submission to territorial authorities, coordination with neighboring counties that would also be affected by the proposed dam, and a public information campaign to counter Mercer's persuasive rhetoric in town. As darkness fell over Sullivan Ranch, Kate completed her evening chores with heightened awareness of what was at stake. The quiet routine of feeding livestock and checking fence lines carried deeper significance when viewed against the backdrop of forces threatening to transform the entire region. In her engineering shed, Kate lit a lamp and spread out fresh drafting. paper, beginning to map counter-strategies against the dam project she now knew was Western Development's ultimate goal. Her technical knowledge, once hidden from neighbors as a private skill, had become a crucial community resource in the escalating water war. The tools of her former profession, long set aside in favor of the simpler life she had chosen with Marshall, were once again in her hands, not for private gain, but in service to the community that had become her home. As she worked late into the night, Kate felt a sense of purpose that transcended the defense of her own property. The widow Sullivan, as Riverdale knew her, was disappearing, replaced by Catherine Monroe Sullivan, hydraulic engineer and strategist, fully emerging from the shadow of grief and self-imposed obscurity to face the greatest professional and personal challenge of her life. The tension in Clearwater County had reached a breaking point. 2 weeks had passed since Kate's discovery of Western Development's dam survey, weeks filled with frantic preparation, political maneuvering, and increasingly bold sabotage attempts. The ranchers had implemented interconnected defensive water systems across most properties, transforming individual holdings into a coordinated network that had thus far repelled every attack Rawlins had launched. But Kate knew they were living on borrowed time. Each thwarted attempt taught their adversaries more about the defensive capabilities, allowing them to adapt their tactics. Meanwhile, Mercer had secured the support of Judge Harmon and Mayor Wilson, establishing legal groundwork for the company's broader ambitions. The community was fracturing along increasingly defined lines, ranchers and farmers against townspeople who stood to benefit from Western Development's promised prosperity. Dawn broke over Sullivan Ranch with an unsettling stillness. Kate had spent the night in her observation post in the barn loft, watching for movement along the property boundaries. Unlike previous nights, she had detected nothing. No scouts, no saboteurs, not even the distant watchers who had maintained surveillance. For days, the absence of activity troubled her more than their presence would have. As she made her morning rounds, Kate noticed dark clouds gathering on the northern horizon. A storm system moving in that would bring much-needed rain, but also reduced visibility and potential vulnerability. Weather had always been both ally and adversary to ranchers, and today's approaching storm felt particularly ominous. Tommy Jenkins arrived as Kate was checking the windmill's mechanisms, his pinto's hooves kicking up dust as he galloped into the yard. The boy's face was flushed with urgency. "Mrs. Sullivan," he called, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. "They've arrested my pa." Kate's blood ran cold. "What? Why?" "Sheriff Parker's deputy came at dawn with papers from Judge Harmon," Tommy explained breathlessly. "Said Pa was being held for water rights violations and property damage against Western Development's legal claims. Took him to town in handcuffs." This was a new tactic, using legal action to remove key members of the resistance. Tom Jenkins, Sr. had been instrumental in coordinating the ranch's unified defense strategy. With him in custody, their organization would be significantly weakened. "What about your mother?" Kate asked, her mind already calculating ramifications and responses. "She sent me to warn you," Tommy replied. "Said you might be next, that you should be careful." Kate nodded grimly. If Mercer was using legal channels to target resistance leaders, she would indeed be high on his list. Her technical expertise and organizational abilities made her the linchpin of the community's defense. "Tommy, I need you to ride to the Henderson place, then to Mitchell's and Davis's. Tell them what's happened and remind them of the contingency plan we discussed. Then go home and stay with your mother. Don't come back here today." The boy looked ready to protest, but something in Kate's expression stopped him. He nodded, remounting his pinto and setting off toward the Henderson ranch at a gallop. Alone again, Kate moved quickly through final preparations she had hoped wouldn't be necessary. From her shed, she retrieved the comprehensive documentation of Western Development's activities she had compiled, evidence of sabotage, intimidation, and legal manipulation that might not hold up in Judge Harmon's compromised court, but could sway territorial authorities. These papers, along with her most critical engineering documents and personal valuables, went into a waterproof satchel she secured to Shadow's saddle in the barn. The horse remained saddled and ready, a precaution against the need for quick departure. Kate then methodically checked each of her defensive control points, making final adjustments to ensure they could be activated quickly and would function properly despite the approaching storm. The air felt charged with both the impending weather and the certainty of conflict. Mid-morning brought Sheriff Parker, riding alone up the long approach to Sullivan Ranch. His expression was troubled as he dismounted, removing his hat as Kate met him on the porch. "You've heard about Tom Jenkins," he said without preamble. Kate nodded. "Judge Harmon's work, I presume." "Technically, yes. The papers came through his court, but Mercer's lawyers drafted them." Wade's weathered face showed the strain of a man caught between duty and conscience. "They've filed similar complaints against you, Kate. I've been ordered to bring you in for questioning." Though she had anticipated this development, the reality of it still sent a chill through her. "And are you going to?" Wade's gaze held hers steadily. "I've known you and Marshall for 15 years. I'm not here to arrest you." He glanced over, his shoulder back toward town. "But I'm also not the only law in the county anymore. Mercer's hired private security with dubious legal authority, but very real guns. They'll be coming for you if I don't return with you." "How many?" Kate asked, her mind shifting to tactical assessment. "At least 20 that I've seen. And Kate—" He hesitated, his voice lowering. "Rollins is back. He rode into town last night with another dozen men. They're not bothering with the pretense of being surveyors or businessmen anymore. These are gunmen, plain and simple." This explained the absence of surveillance around her property. They were consolidating forces for a major operation rather than continuing piecemeal sabotage attempts. "Thank you for the warning, Wade," Kate said quietly. "You should go back. Before they get suspicious, tell them I wasn't here, that you're continuing to look for me. It might buy a little time." The sheriff nodded reluctantly. "Be careful, Kate. Mercer's using the law as a weapon, but Rawlins doesn't care about legalities. If they can't arrest you, they'll find other ways to remove you as an obstacle." After Wade departed, Kate moved with purposeful efficiency. She had prepared for this eventuality, developing contingency plans for various scenarios, including direct assault on her property. Now, she implemented those plans with methodical precision. First, she activated the early warning system at the property boundaries, subtle mechanisms that would alert her to approaching riders regardless of which direction they came from. Next, she set the primary defensive systems to standby mode, where they could be fully activated with minimal adjustments when needed. The storm clouds drew closer as the afternoon progressed, casting an eerie half-light across the landscape. Kate positioned herself in the barn loft, which offered both protection and visibility, with clear sight lines to each critical point on her property. From here, she could monitor approaches and access control mechanisms for the most crucial defensive systems. By late afternoon, the first fat raindrops began to fall, quickly intensifying into a steady downpour that reduced visibility and muffled sounds. Kate remained vigilant, knowing the storm provided cover for approach but also enhanced certain aspects of her defenses. Rain-saturated ground would amplify the effects of her hydraulic traps, turning moderately muddy areas into nearly impassable quagmires. The warning signal came just before dusk, a subtle vibration in the tripwire mechanism she had installed. Along the eastern approach, through sheets of rain, Kate caught glimpses of movement, riders, at least a dozen, moving slowly but deliberately toward her property. Rather than approaching the house directly, they split into smaller groups each, taking a different route, a tactical deployment suggesting they had studied her property and were targeting specific points. Kate recognized Rawlins' shape among the central group heading directly for the windmill, his tall figure distinctive even in the gathering gloom. This was no sabotage attempt or intimidation display. It was a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm her defenses and seize control of Sullivan Ranch's water infrastructure. The legal groundwork laid by Mercer would provide post-facto justification once they had established physical control. Kate's hand moved to Marshall's pocket watch, drawing strength from the connection to her past before focusing entirely on the present threat. She had anticipated this moment, prepared for it meticulously, yet the reality of facing overwhelming force alone sent a momentary shiver through her that had nothing to do with the rain seeping through her coat. The nearest group of riders approached, the irrigation control station near the eastern pasture, a critical node in her defensive network. Through her spyglass, Kate could see them carrying tools that suggested they intended to dismantle rather than destroy the mechanism. With careful precision, she adjusted the valve controlling water flow to that sector. Unlike previous defensive actions that had created visible jets or gradual flooding, this response was more subtle, a deliberate weakening of the soil structure. Beneath the seemingly solid ground surrounding the control station, the riders dismounted, unaware that the earth beneath them was being transformed by invisible hydrodynamic forces. As they moved toward the control station, the ground suddenly gave way, not into mud, but into a sinkhole that dropped two men waist-deep into cold, clinging soil. Their startled shouts carried faintly through the rain as companions attempted to help, only to create wider instability that threatened their own footing. Simultaneously, a second group approached the secondary well near the southern fence line. Kate activated a different defense here, underground pipes that redirected rainfall into pressurized channels, creating a zone around the well where water erupted from seemingly solid ground in unpredictable patterns. The men's confusion was evident as they encountered terrain that fought back in ways they couldn't anticipate or counter, but these outer defenses were merely delaying tactics. Kate's attention remained focused on Rawlins and his central group as they approached the windmill, the heart of her water system and clearly their primary target. Through the intensifying rain, she watched them advance cautiously, having learned from previous encounters to be wary of defensive measures. Kate waited until they had fully committed to their approach before activating the windmill's primary protection system. Unlike the subtle defenses at the perimeter, this response was dramatic, a synchronized release from multiple underground reservoirs that transformed the entire area around the windmill into a circular moat of churning water. Within seconds, Rawlins and his men halted in confusion as the ground between them and their target suddenly became an impassable barrier. Even through the storm, Kate could see Rawlins gesturing angrily, redirecting his men to search for a way across the unexpected obstacle. This was the moment Kate had planned for. While Rawlins's attention was focused on the windmill defense, she moved quickly from the barn to a secondary control point concealed in an old lightning-struck oak. From here, she could implement the final phase of her defensive strategy, not just protecting individual points, but transforming the battlefield itself. With several precise adjustments to flow valves, Kate initiated a sequence that would progressively activate all defensive systems simultaneously rather than individually. The effect began gradually, but accelerated as interconnected mechanisms triggered each other in a hydraulic chain reaction. Across the property, the rain-soaked ground began responding to invisible forces, depressions filling with water, seemingly solid paths becoming unstable, safe areas transforming into hazards. The carefully engineered terrain that Kate and Marshall had spent years creating revealed its ultimate purpose, not just irrigation and water management, but comprehensive defensive capability. Through her spyglass, Kate watched confusion spread among the attackers as they found themselves confronting not individual traps, but an environment that seemed to have come alive against them. Men who stepped back from one hazard found themselves encountering another. Groups that attempted to consolidate discovered the ground between them becoming increasingly treacherous. In the center of this chaos stood Rawlins, his fury evident, even through the curtain of rain, as he watched his coordinated assault disintegrate into individual struggles against an incomprehensible environment. He fired his pistol in rage, not at any specific target, but at the windmill itself, the bullet pinging harmlessly off metal that had been designed to withstand far worse than gunfire. Kate maintained her position, protected by both concealment and defensive measures, as the assault force gradually fragmented. Some men retreated toward the property boundaries, abandoning equipment and pride in favor of solid ground. Others became stranded on islands of stability, surrounded by water or mud too deep to cross safely in the storm-diminished visibility. Rawlins himself made a final, desperate attempt to reach the windmill, driving his horse into the moat-like defense, only to have the animal balk and throw him when the water proved deeper than anticipated. Kate watched as the man who had threatened everything she valued struggled to his feet, soaked and humiliated, before finally signaling a full retreat to his remaining men. As the attackers withdrew in disarray, Kate allowed herself a moment of grim satisfaction. Her defenses had held, but she harbored no illusions about the conflict being over. Rawlins had been defeated tactically, but not strategically. He would return with different methods, possibly more men, certainly greater anger. The storm continued through the night, providing cover as Kate carefully deactivated certain defensive measures while maintaining others. By dawn, Sullivan Ranch had returned to a semblance of normality, though evidence of the previous night's confrontation remained in churned earth and abandoned equipment. As the first light broke through diminishing clouds, Kate spotted riders approaching, not Rawlins' men returning, but neighbors coming to check on her after observing the retreat of the assault force. Samuel Henderson led the group, which included ranchers from throughout the county, all armed and determined despite the muddy conditions. "We saw them withdraw through our property," Henderson explained as they gathered in Kate's kitchen, grateful for hot coffee after the cold, wet ride. Looked like they'd been through a war rather than an attack on a widow's ranch. Despite exhaustion, Kate smiled. They expected a widow. They found an engineer. Frank Mitchell, who had witnessed part of the retreat from his orchard boundary, shook his head in amazement. Never seen anything like it. Grown men cursing water like it was a living enemy. What exactly did you do to them, Kate? Used their assumptions against them, she replied simply. They thought they were fighting a person defending property. They were actually fighting the property itself. As the conversation continued, Tommy Jenkins burst in, breathless with news. "Pa's been released!" Judge Harmon withdrew the charges this morning after the territorial marshal arrived with questions about improper judicial procedure. This unexpected development changed the dynamic significantly. The territorial marshal's involvement suggested that Kate's earlier communications with authorities outside Clearwater County had borne fruit, bringing external scrutiny to Mercer's legal manipulations. "There's more," Tommy continued excitedly. "Mayor Wilson called an emergency town council meeting. Seems some telegrams arrived exposing Western Development's operations in other territories, showing how they destroyed communities after gaining water control. Even the merchants who supported Mercer are questioning their involvement now." Kate exchanged glances with Henderson, both recognizing this shift in town sentiment could prove decisive. The unified defense of the ranchers had bought crucial time for political and legal challenges to undermine Western Development's carefully constructed legitimacy. By mid-morning, Sheriff Parker arrived with further news. The territorial marshal had issued warrants for Rawlins based on evidence of sabotage and intimidation. Mercer had vacated his hotel room overnight, departing without announcement and leaving unpaid bills behind. A clear sign that Western Development was rapidly abandoning its operation as legal scrutiny intensified. "They're not gone for good," Wade cautioned as the ranchers celebrated this apparent victory. "Companies like theirs change names, shift territories, but keep the same practices. They'll be back in some form somewhere, but not here," Kate said with quiet confidence. "Not in Clearwater County." The following days brought continued positive developments. Judge Harmon, facing investigation for judicial impropriety, resigned. His position, Mayor Wilson, recognizing the shifting political winds, publicly denounced Western Development and proclaimed his commitment to protecting local water rights. The merchants who had been swayed by promises of economic development rediscovered their loyalty to the community that had supported them for generations. 1 week after the failed assault on Sullivan Ranch, the ranchers of Clearwater County gathered to formalize the water management cooperative they had begun developing under pressure. The interconnected defensive systems that had protected their properties would remain, transformed into a shared infrastructure for equitable distribution. During drought and cooperative management during abundance, Samuel Henderson was elected the first president of the Clearwater Watershed Cooperative, with Kate unanimously chosen as chief engineer. The position officially acknowledged what the community had come to recognize, that Catherine Monroe Sullivan's expertise was an invaluable resource that benefited all. As the meeting concluded, Henderson approached Kate with unusual hesitation for a man typically direct in his manner. "The cooperative needs a headquarters," he said, "somewhere central, with the technical facilities to monitor the watershed properly. The committee was thinking your engineering shed might be expanded into something more substantial, with your permission, of course." Kate considered the proposal, recognizing it for what it was, not just a practical suggestion, but symbolic recognition of her place in the community's future. The shed, where she had hidden her talents for years, would become a center for openly sharing knowledge and protecting their collective resources. "I think Marshall would approve," she said finally. "He always said the ranch's water system was built for more than just our needs." Construction began the following month, transforming the modest shed into a proper engineering office with drafting tables, reference materials, and training space where Kate could teach others the principles of hydraulic engineering she had mastered. Young men and women from throughout the county, including Tommy Jenkins, whose fascination with water systems had blossomed into a genuine aptitude, came to learn from the woman now openly acknowledged as the foremost water expert in the territory. Territorial authorities, impressed by the cooperative's organization and technical foundation, granted formal recognition of their water rights management structure, establishing a precedent that would protect them from future corporate acquisition attempts. The documentation Kate had compiled about Western Development's methods was circulated to other countries, creating awareness that helped communities recognize and resist similar tactics elsewhere. 1 year after Rawlins' men first appeared in Clearwater County, Kate stood beside her windmill, watching as Thomas Edison's newly hired expert engineer documented the innovative water management system for potential replication in drought-prone regions nationwide. The man's astonishment at finding such sophisticated hydraulic engineering in a remote western county amused Kate, though she received his professional admiration with gracious modesty. "Mrs. Sullivan," the engineer remarked as he completed his notes, "you could have made a fortune with these designs in New York or Chicago. What kept you here, managing a ranch in the middle of nowhere?" Kate's gaze moved across the landscape, the thriving crops, healthy livestock, and distant rooftops of neighbors whose prosperity was intertwined with her own through the water network they now shared. "This isn't anywhere," she replied simply. "This is home." As the visitor departed, Kate turned her attention to a group of young apprentices arriving for their weekly lesson in hydraulic principles. Tommy Jenkins, now her assistant instructor at 17, organized their materials while Kate prepared demonstrations using the scale models she had built to illustrate key concepts. The windmill turned steadily above them, its metal blades catching. The afternoon sun, as it had for decades, no longer just the heart of Sullivan Ranch's water system, but a symbol of resilience for an entire community. The woman known once as merely a rancher's widow now stood tall in her full identity, Catherine Monroe Sullivan, engineer, teacher, and guardian of Clearwater County's most precious resource. The bandits who had tried to destroy her windmill had unwittingly accomplished what years of quiet widowhood had not. They had revealed the true power of water in the hands of someone who understood not just its engineering principles, but its capacity to unite a community in defense of their shared future. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.